I'm going to just start reading from the new book. And I'll just start reading from it. And then after that, we'll do the roll call, and then I'll answer your questions. So keep the super chats rolling in to give me something to talk about in the second half of the show. And I will now start reading. Here we go. On December 19th, 2024, the New York City Police Department paraded Luigi Mangione before the press in what his lawyer described as the biggest perp walk I've ever seen in my career. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, currently under federal indictment, was on hand as Mangione was escorted from a helicopter with an entourage of 15, many holding large firearms. New York City Mayor Eric Adams defended his actions, saying, "I wanted to send a strong message with the police commissioner that we are leading from the front. I'm not going to allow him to come into our city. I wanted to look him in the eye and state that you carried out this terrorist act in my city, the city that the people of New York love, and I wanted to be there to show the symbolism of that." Often, the mainstream media's response to acts of politicized violence is to downplay them. Much like suicides, the media does not wish to inspire others with coverage, and in cases of political violence, coverage is exactly what the perpetrators are seeking. However, this was not the case for the killing of Brian Thompson, the CEO of the largest health insurance provider in America, on December 4th, 2024. Before the perpetrator had even been caught, social media exploded with celebration. When it was reported that the shell casings had been inscribed with a political message, the celebration intensified. When the image of the suspect's face hit social media, immediately people were fawning over how good-looking he was. Brian Thompson, the 50-year-old CEO of United Healthcare Group, was a pretty atypical billionaire corporate executive. The Associated Press described him as keeping a low public profile. He had been married and divorced. In 2017, he had been arrested for drunk driving. At the time of his death, he was facing insider trading investigations and a lawsuit from the Florida Firefighters Pension Fund. He lived in Minnesota, but frequently visited New York City for business. No doubt his corporation, United Healthcare, like every insurance provider, received more profits by the fewer claims it paid out. As the CEO of United Healthcare, Thompson's legal obligation was to maximize profit for his shareholders, which, in the case of a health insurance provider under the U.S. private healthcare system, meant paying out as little as possible. To say Brian Thompson had blood on his hands and was responsible for deaths as a functionary of a completely unjust, irrational, and immoral, profit-centered healthcare system in America is no exaggeration at all. Just days after the killing, leftists gathered in New York City's Washington Square Park to have a look-alike contest, dressing to imitate the images of the suspect that were circulating. The New York Post was on hand to cover the silly event and emphasize in the public mind that the killer had public support. Taylor Lorenz, formerly a reporter for the Washington Post, told British TV host Piers Morgan she felt, quote, joy over the killing and giggled about it, before clarifying that she did not advocate political assassinations. The suspected killer, Luigi Mangione, was apprehended in Altoona, Pennsylvania, and immediately declared by a social media explosion to be a heroic activist sticking up for the working class people whose healthcare claims were routinely denied. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has condemned peaceful pro-Palestine protests for allegedly being anti-Semitic and hurting the feelings of Jewish students, gave an oddly sympathetic statement about the killing. Quote, "This is not to say that an act of violence is justified, But I think anyone who is confused or shocked or appalled, they need to understand that people interpret and feel experience denied claims as an act of violence against them. Healthcare in this country has gotten to such a depraved state that people are living with things they should never have to live with. Her words are a bit surprising, as the Democrat Party, which has held the White House for the past 4 years, has done almost nothing regarding the healthcare issue. In 2020, when comedian Jimmy Dore raised his Force the Vote campaign, urging AOC to demand a vote on Medicare for all in exchange for selecting Nancy Pelosi, this was condemned in the strongest language. Dore was called a white supremacist, and his words were considered to be actual violence, quote, against AOC, a, quote, woman of color. Yet many of the very same voices that condemned Dore with vitriol are celebrating the shooting of Brian Thompson. One must ask why a parliamentary procedure was an unforgivable crime, while a premeditated murder on the streets is deemed romantic and acceptable. Other responses to the killing are also odd. National Public Radio's coverage presented the murder as resulting in fewer claim denials from United Healthcare, almost arguing in favor of the killer's actions. As the suspect goes to trial, there is no doubt this idealization of his alleged actions will continue. The result will probably be many other copycat murders or attempted murders. Already, graffiti has gone up across the country, hailing Mangione as a hero. Mangione has not yet been convicted of the crime, and the evidence linking him to the pulling of the trigger has not yet been fully presented. Yet, the phrase alleged is not being used in the press or by public officials in reference to him. A documentary film profiling him has already been announced. News articles are describing his life story and interviewing his college friends and associates. When Mangione's name was mentioned at the opening of a joke on the December 21st episode of Saturday Night Live, the studio audience erupted into applause. Colin Jost chided the crowd a little, saying, "You're cheering for justice, you're cheering for justice," trying to reframe the applause as for the arrest, not for Mangione himself. The press has decided already that not only is Mangione guilty, but that he is a tragic anti-hero, a supervillain, or a vigilante for the common man, etc. Mangione's background raises some questions. The suspect, like many of the leftist terrorists of previous generations, was not some working class person who just couldn't take it anymore. He's an Ivy League graduate from a very wealthy family. While those looking to make him a heroic vigilante focused on his manifesto and statements about the healthcare system, what was left out was his own family's ties to the healthcare industry. Questions about whether this was some kind of falling out within the healthcare industry have been marginally raised. Alex Jones noted that Thompson was scheduled to testify in congressional hearings about corruption in the healthcare industry and that, quote, "dead men tell no tales." Among socialists and communists, few voices of common sense prevailed. The Revolutionary Communist Party circulated a statement saying, quote, "The healthcare system is driven by the vicious, cold-blooded, profit above all else system of capitalist imperialism, not individual CEOs. And the solution is an actual revolution, not based on revenge, but on the emancipation of humanity." And going on to quote leader Bob Avakian saying, quote, "The purpose and goal of the revolution is not revenge. And if revenge becomes what motivates people, this will take the whole revolution off course and will end up right back where we were before." The Center for Political Innovation circulated the well-known "Who Do I Shoot" passage from the 1939 novel The Grapes of Wrath. See Appendix 1. It's printed in the back of the book. The passage, often cited by Marxists, tells of a farmer trying to avoid being evicted from his home, being convinced not to shoot the sheriff, and coming to understand that the problems are systemic and cannot be solved by killing one person. Opposition to left adventurism and terrorism is pretty standard Marxism-Leninism. Yet those who held on to a basic ideological and tactical principle, seeking a mass movement, not isolated acts of terrorism, were widely drowned out in a wave of gleeful celebration of vengeance. Mainstream media whipped up applause from the left, and those who dissented were accused of, quote, defending a CEO and advocating we just beg them. This is all extremely dangerous, and it should be obvious why. Brian Thompson was certainly a wealthy CEO in an industry that harms working people on a routine basis. There's no need to defend his actions or act like anger at people like him is not justified. But the problems of the U.S. healthcare system are not the fault of bad people. They are the fault. The problems of the healthcare system are not the fault of bad people who need to be punished. They are systemic. They are rooted in the fact that administering public health, an important service, has been left under the care of the invisible hand of the market. While the state facilitates the healthcare system, unlike in every other Western country, healthcare in the United States is totally private, is totally a private for-profit endeavor. Health insurance is not guaranteed to U.S. citizens, but a service that they must pay for. Hospitals are private, and the result has been maximizing costs and profits for private owners at the expense of the population. Studies have shown that many home foreclosures are the result of medical bills. Barack Obama's presidency opened with promises to fix the healthcare system that were hugely disappointing to his supporters. The Affordable Care Act, nicknamed Obamacare, changed very little about the healthcare system other than imposing a mandate for health insurance with a tax penalty and making it easier for people with pre-existing conditions to purchase insurance. Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential primary campaign in the Democrat Party was largely rooted on his support for Medicare for all. The campaign was sabotaged from within, with leaked emails revealing that the Democratic Party rigged its primary to ensure that Hillary Clinton became the nominee. In July of 2021, Medicare for All marches were held across the United States, but the liberal establishment condemned them. A large number of articles emphasized that former white nationalist Matt Heimbeck had participated in planning one of the rallies to be held in Indiana before he was disinvited. Heimbeck had even publicly recanted his white nationalist views, but this, of course, did not prevent this story from somehow being worth coverage. The non-involvement of one person with Nazi ties in one of 50 rallies across the country was the subject of lengthy articles in The Real News, Salon, The Daily Beast, and Business Insider, all warning about so-called fascist infiltration and scolding the protests as, quote, class reductionist, because they focused on an economic issue that could unite Americans across racial and cultural lines. The Indiana Medicare for All march was canceled. The rally in Los Angeles pushed out a number of respected activists due to their position on vaccinations after negative media coverage. Much like the Rage Against the War Machine protests held in February of 2023, the Medicare for All marches were condemned as loudly as possible by the established left, with the organizers scrambling to appease the divided participants amid a wave of social media hate. The demand for universal health care coverage was considered, quote, white, because it did not explicitly highlight the needs of African Americans, LGBT people, or various, quote, marginalized communities. The fact that religious and conservative voices who supported Medicare for All were included in these rallies was considered an unforgivable crime, using a phrase coined by Russian President Boris Yeltsin. The Medicare for All marches were labeled a red-brown alliance. Yet fast forward 3 years, and the very same leftist voices, such as Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian, that saw marching with conservatives for healthcare reform as an unforgivable crime, are now defending the act of a 26-year-old white man killing a 50-year-old white man in Midtown Manhattan as based and heroic. The killing of Brian Thompson comes just after the victory of Donald Trump in the 2024 election in November. As Trump prepares to take the oath of office, the foreign policy establishment is seething with rage. The fact that Trump has selected dissenting figures such as Tulsi Gabbard, Robert Kennedy Jr., Matt Gaetz, and Kash Patel to serve in his administration has sparked further outrage. The country is bracing for the rioting and violence that will inevitably take place on January 20th, 2025, when Trump is sworn in. The entity that will preside over the protests will be the Party for Socialism and Liberation, this supposedly anti-imperialist communist group, funded by billionaire Roy Singham and operating the People's Forum in New York City, among other well-funded organizing centers, had its obscure 2024 presidential campaign highlighted by The Guardian, a pro-imperialist, pro-NATO mainstream British outlet. The organization has reserved permits for a massive, quote, People's March to oppose Donald Trump's inauguration. When Trump was sworn in for his first term in 2017, the streets rocked with violence. Cars were torched, windows were broken, and hundreds were arrested. Later in the year, the country witnessed the Charlottesville riot between supporters and opponents of the Confederate monument in August. The day resulted in one protester dying, 35 being injured, and 2 state troopers being killed when their helicopter crashed. Organizers on all sides of the protest were shocked by how out of control the violence became, as the usual police barricades and riot squads dividing Klansmen from their opponents were not in place. In 2017, the 2017 Unite the Right rally, organized by figures like David Duke and other neo-Nazis and white supremacists, ended up getting much more widely promoted in conservative circles, with many regular Trump supporters being drawn in. The opposition rally was also far more widely promoted than most leftist events, with socialists, communists, and anarchists from across the country busing and driving into a small town in Virginia. Forces far more powerful than the small white nationalist groups who organized Unite the Right had decided to make the Charlottesville events big. That's clear. The same can be said for the infamous Capitol riot on January 6, 2021, where Trump supporters were able to just walk into the building where congressional proceedings take place. While the media portrayed the event as an attempted coup, more security footage surfaced showing that many protesters had been led around the Capitol almost as tourists. The day's events became the topic of political rhetoric for the following few years, explaining why Trump was a dangerous authoritarian who would, quote, destroy democracy. For a time, the idea that the FBI had been involved in staging the events was decried as a conspiracy theory and mocked by mainstream media. However, in December of 2024, as Biden was preparing to leave office, documents released by the U.S. Congress confirmed that 26 FBI assets had been inside the Capitol building during the riot. All of these events point to what is the thesis of this book. There is a strategy being implemented by some within the U.S. power structure that involves fomenting, not stopping, political violence. This is not a strategy by revolutionaries or anti-imperialists, but by the very forces who sit at the top of our current status quo. The hope is to create an atmosphere of political violence and confusing divisions among the population in order to maintain the status quo. This is a strategy for managing the rising dissent and unrest among the population. The hope is to direct dissent in confusing, unclear directions, get the population weary over time, and set the stage for the current order to regain public support. This fits the counterinsurgency strategies openly articulated by Frank Kitson and William S. Lind. This also fits the playbook for how Italy, Northern Ireland, and Jamaica were kept under U.S. NATO domination during the Cold War. What is needed right now is a mass movement of working people to stand up against the emerging low-wage police state and the danger of a new world war. Such a movement would inevitably see the need for popular power to assert control over the economy in order to oversee economic growth and relate to the emerging alternative global economy in a win-win rather than confrontational manner, embracing multipolarity, demanding health care for all, and opposing the profit-centered apparatus that deprives Americans of needed health care routinely should no doubt be part of such a movement. However, random revenge killings will hinder, not help such a movement from emerging. It is clear the U.S. mainstream media is creating toxic narratives around Thompson's murder as part of a counterinsurgency strategy, and it is the duty of those of us who take seriously the task of building a movement to fight for working families to not play into their hands. And that's the introduction. And then I'll start reading chapter 1 in just a second. I need a drink of water. Yeah, I'm happy to have put this book out. But I'm saying what no one else is saying. I really put my heart and soul into this book. I wrote it very quickly. If you want to get it, there's a tiny URL where you can buy the book. And I see that we've got one or two Rumble rants for me to answer in the second half of the show from Hempcar, or 3 from Hempcar. So that's good. If anyone has any super chats, that would be good as well. I'll be answering questions in the second half of the show. But I'm just going to keep reading. Why not, right? So we'll start with chapter 1, the actual problem and solution. The gleeful celebration of Brian Thompson's killing seems to flow, in many cases, from a very limited understanding of the crisis facing our society. The mindset of your typical Luigi admirer seems to be that U.S. society is suffering from a crisis of bad people. Individuals like Brian Thompson are selfish and want more and more money and do not consider the needs of others in their pursuit of it. The logic then follows that vigilantes inflicting punishment or vengeance on such individuals can force them to behave in a more humane way out of fear of retaliation. If healthcare CEOs are afraid of being shot, they will be more considerate in how they treat their clients and approve more claims. Problem solved. Well, the crisis of U.S. society is about a lot more than bad people. And even if purely kind-hearted and well-intentioned people sat at the top of all the major health insurance corporations, the problems would still exist. The problem is we live in a society where the centers of economic power, the banks, factories, stores, natural resources, and other means of production, are operated in order to maximize profits for their owners. The owners of stock in these corporations elect CEOs like Brian Thompson to ensure the return on their investment is maximized. The purpose of United Healthcare is not to provide services to those in need, but to maximize profits for shareholders. The consequences of denied coverage in the lives of United Healthcare clients is an externality in business terms. It does not factor into the bottom line. If Brian Thompson or some other CEO of some other corporation was found to be working with other intentions, seeking to benefit public good rather than maximize profits, his shareholders could sue him, as he is legally obligated to serve their interests. The rule of the world in our time is profits in command. Corporations like United Healthcare are usually tied to major houses of finance. Big banks sit at the center of a wide variety of enterprises, all seeking to maximize profits, not just in the United States, but around the world. This order of the world, where a small group of bankers, organized into a variety of trusts, cartels, and syndicates, sit at the center of the global economy, seeking to rake in as much profit as possible, is rightly called globalism imperialism, or imperialism globalism. It is monopolistic capitalism and involves the government propping up and colluding with these ultra monopolies to secure their position at the center of the world market and maximize their profits. In American history, this system of globalism and big corporations extracting super profits at the expense of humanity was condemned by Henry Charles Carey and Alexander Hamilton. They saw the American Revolution as repudiating it and establishing the country in opposition to the English system. Carey wrote, quote, "Two systems are before the world. One looks to exporting men to occupied desert tracts, the sovereignty of which is obtained by the aid of diplomacy or war. The other to increasing the value and immense extent of vacant land by importing men by millions for their occupation. One looks to the concentration of wealth and power in a great commercial city that shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are being supported by aid of contributions which have exhausted every nation subjected to them. The other to concentration by which a market shall be made upon the land for the products of the land, and the farmer and the planter be enriched. One looks to increasing the necessity for commerce, the other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level, the other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other toward universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. Such is the true mission of the people of these United States. The view of Henry Charles Carey, rooted in the economic theories of Alexander Hamilton and expounded on by German economist Friedrich List, was that the British bankers were setting up a global economic system that held back development and ground nations into poverty in order to concentrate wealth of the world into an elite class of bankers. They viewed the emerging industrial economy of the United States as the opposite model. Quote, "To raise the value of labor throughout the world, we need only to raise the value of our own. To raise the value of land throughout the world, it is needed only that we adopt measures that we shall raise the value of our own. To diffuse intelligence and promote the cause of morality throughout the world, we are required only to pursue that shall diffuse education throughout our own land and shall enable every man to more readily acquire property, and with it respect for the rights of property. To improve the political condition of man throughout the world, it is needed that we ourselves should remain at peace, avoid taxation for the maintenance of fleets and armies, and become rich and prosperous. To raise condition of woman throughout the world, it is required for us only that we pursue the course that enables men to remain at home and to marry, and they may surround themselves happy with children and grandchildren. To substitute true Christianity for the detestable system of Malthusianism is needed that we prove to the world that it is population that makes the food come from the rich soil, and that food tends to increase more rapidly than population, thus vindicating the policy of God to man. To prove among the people of the world, whether agriculturalists, manufacturers, or merchants, there is perfect harmony of interests, and that the happiness of individuals, as well as the grandeur of nations, is to be promoted by perfect obedience to the greatest of all commands, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, is the object and will of that mission. Lenin, the founder of the Bolshevik Party and the creator of the Soviet Union, called this system imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He argued in the 1890s that capitalism had transcended the stage of industrial manufacturers extracting profits from hiring wage workers and had entered a stage where bankers sought to dominate entire global markets. Lenin explained, imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. Its specific character is threefold. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism. The supplanting of free competition by monopoly is the fundamental economic feature, the quintessence of imperialism. Lenin wrote about trusts, cartels, and syndicates, and an international financial oligarchy that sought to seize chunks of the planet with territorial partition. He explained the monopolistic position of the big banks. 3, 4, or 5 giant banks manipulate the whole economic life of America, France, Germany, the seizure of the sources of raw materials by trusts and the financial oligarchy. Finance capitalism is monopoly, industrial capitalism merged with bank capital. He went on to describe there are already over 100 such international cartels, which command the entire world market and divide it amicably among themselves until war redivides it. Lenin broke with the standard Marxist view that the future lay in a struggle between factory owners and factory workers in the Western world. He argued that socialism would come into the world as a result of struggles for national liberation, in which entire nations wrenched themselves free from imperialism, with the working class at the lead, as it had the most to gain and was becoming the global majority. The Bolshevik Revolution, and eventually the Chinese, Cuban, Vietnamese, and Korean revolutions, were fought on the basis of this understanding. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, in contemporary Russia and China, there has been a rising interest in a school of thought called geopolitics that links civilizations and their way of being to the locations in which they arise. The philosopher Alexander Dugin divides the civilizations of history into thalassocracy, empires of the sea, and talarocracy, empires of the land. Geopolitical analysts contrast how the land civilizations must focus on development in order to hold land masses together, whereas the empires of the sea simply control trade routes and extract tribute. As Dugin explained in his 2015 book, The Last War of the World Island, The Geopolitics of Contemporary Russia, quote, Russia is doomed to conflict with the civilization of the sea, with thalassocracy as embodied today in the USA and the unipolar American-centric world order. The victory of civilization of the sea over civilization of the land constitutes the essence of globalization. The USA is the center and core of the reality that is now global, bourgeois, democratic thalassocracy. Democratization, westernization, Americanization, and globalism essentially represent various aspects of a total attack by civilization of the sea, the hegemony of the sea. All three of these schools of thought point to the same system being the problem. The same enemy for those who want a better life for all humanity. They all point to a system where gigantic mega corporations like United Healthcare stretch their tentacles across the planet, impoverishing the world in order to pile more and more wealth into their own pockets. This system can rightly be called globalism imperialism or imperialism globalism. The focus of progressive forces who want a stronger and richer America, as well as a more peaceful and prosperous world, is the defeat of this system. This globalist imperialist economy of ultra monopolies, maximizing their profits at the expense of humanity, has led to a crisis that would never have been imagined in other epochs. All across the world, people are getting poorer and poorer because more and more wealth is being created. This makes no rational sense. One would expect homelessness to increase due to shortages of housing, or hunger to increase because there were shortages of food. But in our modern world, in which profits are in command, has created a completely irrational problem, the problem of poverty amid plenty, or rather poverty created by abundance. In 2008, the US economy crashed because the housing bubble burst. What did this really mean? Well, it meant that the various mortgage lending schemes and other practices that had been legalized in the hopes of keeping Americans buying homes as their incomes went down dried up and stopped working. In essence, Americans could not afford to keep buying homes because their incomes had decreased so significantly. With the good paying industrial jobs long gone, household debt and student debt through the roof, and rising healthcare costs, the US public could not keep buying homes, and the housing market crashed. Across America, millions became homeless because too many houses had been created and they couldn't afford to buy them. The housing market faced a huge glut, and the banks that lent money to home buyers crashed. This problem of the value crisis, or the constant gap between consumer spending power and the goods produced, is the basis for the market cycle acknowledged by most economists. Workers are never paid enough in the process of production to buy back what they produce. The US government stimulates the economy with all kinds of mechanisms intended to deal with this problem. For example, in Springfield, Missouri, there is a cave that has billions of dollars of cheese buried in it. The US government buys this cheese from farmers and buries it in order to inflate dairy prices and keep the farming sector from collapsing. This ever constant problem is exacerbated by technological leaps. When technology advances, this means fewer workers are involved in the process of production. Fewer workers are hired, and those who are hired become easier to replace. Fewer wages are paid out. As a result, the spending power of the consumer decreases. The high-tech computer revolution has made this problem bigger than it has ever been in history. Machines can do almost anything in our time, and the role of the wage worker in production is being eliminated more rapidly than ever. The market is churning out products more efficiently than ever before, with fewer and fewer workers hired to help create them than ever before. What does this mean? It means the wages paid out are less than they have ever been. The labor movement has generally been a counterweight to this process. Labor unions demand higher pay for workers and tend to intervene in the political process to push for policies resulting in a social safety net. In every other Western country, as a result of labor unions and social democratic government policies, the government has guaranteed the population health insurance. However, that is not the case in the United States. The labor unions have always been significantly weaker, and the welfare state has always been far more limited. No national health care service or insurance plan exists in the United States. And in the private for-profit system, 26 million working people have no insurance at all. Those who are insured are left at the mercy of their providers, often battling for months for the coverage of the medical services that they need. So, what is the solution? How do we stop the increasing impoverishment, unemployment, and lack of healthcare access among the American working class? Well, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need the state to beat back the power of big corporations and force the major centers of economic power to operate in the interests of society overall and not merely function for the profits of their owners. Society must seize control of the economy, and popular power must be asserted over the means of production. The way the healthcare debate is framed is often very pessimistic. The argument is that corporations, to whom the politicians are beholden, often get tax breaks and corporate subsidies. If they get free stuff, why shouldn't the population also get some? This is not incorrect, but it frames the argument incorrectly. Providing health care to the population should not be considered a handout or welfare program, but rather an investment. Human labor is the source of all wealth. Human creativity and innovation are the motor force of history. If we wish to have a strong, prosperous economy in America, we will need to have a strong, healthy population. The stronger and healthier our people are, the more wealth they can create with their labor power, the more innovation they can carry out with their minds, and the more prosperous of a society we will be. If one recognizes that human beings are a great asset for creating a wealthier and more prosperous society, and that the job of the state is to ensure continued economic expansion, it makes perfect sense to provide high-quality health care to all. Furthermore, the health care that the state provides should be focused on prevention and maintaining long-term health, not simply treating illness. Throughout human history, there has been an understanding that the state has an obligation to ensure public good and raise living standards. The reason feudal monarchs and aristocrats, or the church in medieval Europe, commissioned Bach to compose his music and Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel was because they understood the duty of the state to enhance the life of the public. Government was understood to have an obligation to engage in social transformation and improvement. The liberal ideology that dominates Western discourse says the opposite. We are told the government is best that governs least. Neoliberal economists inform us that the only obligation the state has is to protect private property. Our de facto leaders, those who sit atop the system of globalism imperialism, do not see the population as a source of great wealth and innovation. The belief of the ruling elite, as spelled out at the World Economic Forum and in many public statements of Bill Gates and others, is that we suffer from overpopulation. They believe that there are too many people in the world, and that rather than seeing the problems of the world as a result of irrational markets and profits in command, they believe we need to reduce consumption and reduce the population in order to stabilize the economy. All around the world, many governments have emerged as a result of struggles to defeat globalism imperialism. The anti-colonial revolutions of the 20th century enabled Russia and China to industrialize and become superpowers. They enabled many countries throughout Africa and Latin America to seize control of their own economies and resources and start building. As a result of the anti-colonial revolutions, a new economy has emerged. The BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America, the various independent governments of Africa, and the Axis of Resistance in the Middle East all point to an alternative to globalism imperialism. The big monopolies of the Western countries want to go all out to crush this new economy. Globalism imperialism seeks to maintain unipolarity, with the world centered around one pole of power, the Western financial centers, namely Wall Street and London. Whereas the rallying cry of the new economy is for multipolarity. They seek for Russia and China, as well as Africa and Latin America, to have equal weight in a new global order based on win-win cooperation, not viewing international relations and trade as a zero-sum game. What is needed is for the American people to bring to power a government that is opposed to globalism imperialism and represents the real interests of the American people. Such a government would beat back the power of Wall Street and reorganize the economy to focus on growth and expansion and cooperation with the new economic bloc. The Center for Political Innovation has published a 4-point plan to bring such a government into being. 1. A mass mobilization to rebuild the country. Now is the time to hire millions of unemployed at union wages. Put them to work rebuilding the roads, bridges, water treatment facilities, power plants, schools, and hospitals of the country. High-speed railway must connect the Midwest and South to more prosperous regions. The universities must be revamped, so once again we are churning out the world's greatest scientists and engineers. A brain trust of the smartest minds must be assembled in order to lay out a detailed 5-year economic plan. The public must be mobilized to carry it out with the full support of the country's resources. 2, public ownership of natural resources. It has become clear that big corporations and banks are not trustworthy in their management of America's oil, natural gas, coal, timber, and other natural resources. As communities across the country fall into greater poverty, Wall Street monopolists enrich themselves from the natural wealth of American soil. Nationalization of these resources will end the budget deficit. The profits from America's wealth must go to the country overall, not the pockets of a few bankers. Popular power will be far more capable of managing these resources to ensure a better future. 3, public control of banking. Speculation. Money created from money with no real added value hangs as a curse over the U.S. economy. The Bible, the Torah, the Quran, and every major religion historically has forbidden the lending of money at interest because it creates an ultra-rich creditor class, bringing the problem of monopolistic stagnation, extreme centralization of wealth in the hands of a few. The lending of money should no longer be carried out for profit, but should be done by communities and the country overall at the local, state, and federal levels. In place of the financial sector, a national bank, as well as many state and local banks, should be created. Credit should be assigned in accordance with an overall economic plan, securing long-term growth and development. Interest should be paid back into the public budget, lifting the burden of taxation from working families. We need a debt jubilee to reboot our economy from the downward spiral hanging over it. The Federal Reserve ripoff scheme and all other mechanisms through which bankers and monopolies have found ways to siphon off the public budget need to be gotten rid of. We need an economy based on real value created by human labor, power, and creativity, not the various schemes invented to generate worthless paper for those who are already rich. In his final state, and this is number 4, an economic Bill of Rights, in his final State of the Union address, President Franklin Roosevelt proposed an economic Bill of Rights. The right to a job, housing, education, and health care must be added to the U.S. Constitution. No one in the country should be left hungry while so much wealth exists. No one should be homeless in a country with millions of empty houses and apartments. All who can work should be hired to do useful work building a better America. Education should be considered a necessity for maintaining an informed population and a healthy country. We must invest in our population as a great resource for making a stronger country. In order to bring such a government into being, it is necessary to create a mass movement of working people. Such a government could only come about if a well-organized and conscious population was brought into action to support it and push its goals. The killing of Brian Thompson will not help bring such a movement into being. It is a complete misdirection of popular outrage about the healthcare system on many, many levels. It was carried out in isolation by a single individual. It is the masses of people in their millions who are the makers of history, not lone wolves with revolvers. The deed does not point towards systemic problems or offer solutions or demands to aid the healthcare crisis. It moralizes the question, presenting the problem of healthcare as the result of bad people like Brian Thompson who just need to be punished or terrorized into acting in a more ethical way. The act links those who oppose corporate power and demand healthcare to violence and terrorism in the public mind. In an atmosphere of school shootings and increasing instability, most Americans do not want more violence, and this incident leads them to identify opposition to corporate power with such violence. This alienates the population from the mass organizing that is needed and will set the stage for more police repression. These 3 points fit the standard critique of adventurism and terrorist methods made by sincere revolutionary forces over the years. Lenin wrote about the problem of individual terror in Russia. Quote, "We know from the past and see in the present that only new forms of mass movement or awakening of new sections of the masses to independent struggle really rouse a spirit of struggle and courage in all. Single combat, however, inasmuch as it remains single combat waged by the Balamazovs, has the immediate effect of simply creating a short-lived sensation, while indirectly it leads to apathy and passive waiting for the next bout." He also wrote, "The terrorists bow to the spontaneity of the passionate indignation of intellectuals who lack the ability or opportunity to connect the revolutionary struggle and the working class movement into an integral whole." He went on to call out his opponents who embraced terrorism as a way to avoid their own responsibility to educate the population. Svoboda advocates terror as a means of exciting the working class and giving it a strong impetus. It is difficult to imagine an argument that more thoroughly disproves itself. Are there not enough outrages committed in Russian life without special excitants having to be invented? On the other hand, is it not obvious that those who are not and cannot be roused to excitement, even by Russian tyranny, will stand by twiddling their thumbs and watch a handful of terrorists engage in single combat with the government? The fact is that the working masses are roused to a high pitch of excitement by the social evils in Russian life, but we are unable to gather, if one may put it, and concentrate all these drops and streamlets of popular resentment that are brought forth to a large extent than we imagine by the conditions of Russian life. And that must be combined into a single gigantic torrent. That this can be accomplished is irrefutably proved by the enormous growth of the working class movement and the eagerness noted above with which workers clamor to our political literature. On the other hand, calls for terror and calls to lend economic struggle itself a political character are merely two different forms of evading the most pressing duty now resting on Russian revolutionaries, namely the organization of comprehensive political agitation. In the following chapters, we will point to some deeper issues, namely why the mainstream media is openly advertising and celebrating this criminal act as a method of counterinsurgency, as well as the deeply spiritual problems of glorifying vengeance and terrorism. This is chapter 2 of my new book, The Killing of Brian Thompson and the Danger of an American Years of Lead. There is a very naive assumption on the part of many people that the job of revolutionaries is simply to inspire people to be violent. The assumption is that if the passive majority were to just wake up, they would rise up and overthrow the system. This naive Hollywood understanding of revolution sees it as nothing more than an explosive release of pent-up rage at the status quo. In reality, revolution is a much more complex process. The engineers of successful revolutions knew this very well. The polemics of Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, Kautsky, Kropotkin, and many other Marxist radicals in the early 20th century are full of terms like Thermidor, Brumaire, and Bonaparte, all of which are references to the events of the French Revolution of the late 18th century. For the European revolutionary intelligentsia, the struggles of Danton, Robespierre, and Jean-Paul Marat were an assumed point of reference. They viewed their movement as the intellectual and spiritual descendant of the French Revolution. In fact, their identification with the political label of left in opposition to rightists was rooted in the seating of the French National Assembly. Academic texts like The Anatomy of a Revolution by Crane Brinton, published in 1938, attempt to spell out these concepts in plain language for those whom the French Revolution is not as familiar as it was in those circles. Brinton's text explains a process that involves the old order fracturing, the elite fighting with each other, and unrest amassing at the bottom of society. From there, the new order begins to assert itself. The new order is made up of organizations among the discontented masses, as well as dissident factions of the old order. As the old order deteriorates and the new order becomes strong, this leads to a climactic moment. The old order breaks down amid a flood of social rage. The new order solidifies itself by restraining the excesses of the masses and suppressing the more chaos-oriented and radical elements who brought it to power. The bulk of the population, the sans-culottes in the French Revolution, are seen as a kind of easily swayed mass that the new order harnesses to take power, while the old order is constantly seeking to restrain them. The old order is conservative and wants the masses to obey leaders and follow social norms, respecting the existing hierarchy and holding their anger and frustrations with life. The revolutionaries are the agitators who stir up the masses to greater confrontation and rebellion against the powers that be. The Bolshevik methods, as first proposed in Lenin's What Is to Be Done, published in 1903, are a refined and strategized version of this revolutionary orientation. The new order is centered around the vanguard party, that functions as the tribune of the people. The vanguard party does not rely on the spontaneity of the masses, which will inevitably be absorbed back into the old system, but instead pushes them into confrontation with the system, working as a bellows to blow up a spark into a general conflagration. The revolutionary organization engages in agitation to the masses, stirring them up to a greater confrontation, while seeking out the best and brightest among the population and propagating to them, teaching them revolutionary ideology, and bringing them under the discipline of the revolutionary organization. For well over 100 years, those who oppose the Western imperialist system have been studying Lenin's writings, along with the further works of Che Guevara, Mao Zedong, and other radicals from the Marxist-Leninist tradition. While this is generally seen as an argument in favor of Marxist-Leninist tactics, it must be understood that for over 100 years, the imperialists have been studying these tactics and methods and working to counter them in the hopes of maintaining their system. An entire school of intelligence and military strategy known as counterinsurgency has been developed for the purpose of preventing events like the Russian, Chinese, Cuban, and Korean revolutions from occurring. The various counterinsurgency texts explaining the tactics of those assigned to defeat anti-colonial revolutions and train others in how to do so are publicly available, and they shed light onto how the present order can hold on to power in the face of mass opposition. One thing that is well known by both effective revolutionaries and effective counterinsurgency theorists is that a key aspect of a successful revolution is polarization. The Bolsheviks took power in October of 1917 because society was heavily polarized around the question of continuing involvement in World War I. The Bolsheviks had a massive organization leading labor unions and militias, and they were the largest and most effective entity opposed to continued involvement in the war. So, when this point of division in Russian society came to a head after the Tsar had abdicated in February, the Bolsheviks took power on a platform of peace, land, and bread, overthrowing the provisional government in October of 1917. In post-World War II China, Chiang Kai-shek became the symbol of the corrupt, intolerable status quo. Mao Zedong and the People's Liberation Army absorbed all who were frustrated and opposed to it. The key moment that secured Mao's victory was the crash of the golden yuan, Chiang's confiscation of all the gold of his wealthiest supporters, forcing them to accept a new paper currency in exchange for it, made him unpopular. When the golden yuan completely crashed and lost its value, at that point, even many of China's wealthiest people went over to Mao's United Front, utterly disgusted by the KMT's mismanagement and corruption. The defeat of France in Algeria and the defeat of the United States in Vietnam are similar stories. The old regime represented colonialism, poverty, corruption, and the disappointment and frustration that had built up for generations. The revolutionaries absorbed and gave voice to all the anger at the status quo and took power. Both British counterinsurgency strategist Frank Kitson and U.S. Cold War strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski reflected extensively on the fact that the profile of a revolutionary is a newly educated person. It is not the illiterate and impoverished peasant or factory worker who becomes Che Guevara or Mao Zedong. Rather, it is the middle-class person from a developing country who becomes educated and in the process becomes further enraged at how they come to understand the world around them to be. William S. Lind, the Pentagon strategist who oversaw U.S. operations in Iraq, has written extensively about fourth-generation warfare. One thing that comes across very clearly in their understanding of how to defeat an insurgency is that the light switch effect must be avoided at all costs. Explaining fourth-generation warfare, William S. Lind wrote, "The military historian Martin van Creveld compares a state military that, with its vast superiority and lethality, continually turns its firepower on a poorly equipped fourth-generation opponent to an adult who administers a prolonged, violent beating to a child in a public place. Regardless of how bad the child has been or how justified the beating might be, every observer sympathizes with the child. The power mismatch is so great that the adult's action is judged a crime. In the 3,000 years that the story of David and Goliath has been told, how many listeners have identified with Goliath?" Lind's fourth-generation warfare handbook gives the following analysis and diagnosis of the cause of insurgencies around the world. Quote, "At the heart of this phenomenon, fourth-generation war, lies not a military evolution, but a political, social, and moral revolution, a crisis of the legitimacy of the state. All over the world, citizens of states are transferring their primary allegiance away from the state to other entities, to tribes, ethnic groups, religions, gangs, ideologies, and causes. Many who are no longer willing to fight for their state will fight for their new primary loyalty." He then offers this prescribed solution. At the most powerful level of war, the moral level, the key to victory is to convince the local population to identify with the state, or at least acquiesce to it, rather than identifying with non-state entities. The goal of a counterinsurgency is to make the population identify with the state. In order to do this, it is necessary to make sure that whatever opposition exists is never solid enough of a force to command the loyalty of the population. The goal is to prevent any notion of what Lenin called dual power. The opposition must never present itself as a solid block or center of gravity. Frank Kitson made a point similar in his writing on what he called low-intensity warfare. Kitson argued that no society is ever totally at war or totally at peace, but rather there is a sliding scale. Kitson wrote, "If subversion fails to achieve the aim, it merges imperceptibly into insurrection, which at the end of the scale covers the activities of small sabotage or terrorist groups, but which spreads across the operational spectrum to include the activities of large groups of armed men. If these gangs become sufficiently numerous and well armed to take on the forces of government in open combat on relatively even terms, insurgency merges into orthodox civil war, because at this stage, force has become the senior partner." He describes the need to suppress and isolate, quote, "subversives before they solidify enough to become terrorists, before they, and from there eventually escalate to the point of a full-scale civil war." Kitson was famous for his use of counter gangs to manipulate the opposition. He composed a book called Gangs and Counter Gangs, describing how the British Empire defeated the Land and Freedom Army of Kenya. And I actually included photos. This is the Land and Freedom Army of Kenya in their fight against the British Empire. So I have a lot of photos in this book. I haven't really been showing the photos, but I'll show some of them as we go through. Right? The book describes capturing Mau Mau fighters and turning them into information gatherers and disinformation spreaders. The biography, Frank Kitson and the Untold Story of Counterinsurgency's Master Strategist by Ryland Hartwell, explains one of his key contributions was the concept of pseudo-gangs, a tactic that would later become synonymous with his name. Pseudo-gangs were small units composed of British soldiers and local Kyaku loyalists who disguised themselves as Mau Mau fighters. Operating behind enemy lines, these units infiltrated Mau Mau networks, gathered intelligence, and sowed distrust among the insurgents. Kitson believed turning Mau Mau's own tactics against them was essential for success. The pseudo-gang tactic proved effective in disrupting the insurgency, although it raised ethical questions that shadowed Kitson's legacy. While it is common for those who fancy themselves to be revolutionaries to study successful revolutions in order to understand the powers that be, how they've maintained their well, hold on, gotta read this paragraph again. While it is common for those who fancy themselves to be revolutionaries to study successful revolutions in order to understand the powers that be and how they have maintained their power and what methods they are likely to use, it is probably more important to study failed insurgencies. When we study failed insurgencies, the ones held up by the defenders of globalism, imperialism as successful models, we learn what techniques they are likely to use against us. So case study number 1, Northern Ireland. If one reads William S. Lynd's work on fourth generation warfare, one model of a successful counterinsurgency that he alludes to numerous times is the post-war troubles in Northern Ireland. It was Frank Kitson, the strategist who coined the phrases low-intensity warfare and counter-gangs, who largely oversaw the operations that led to the surrender of the Provisional Irish Republican Army with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Lynd writes, by using overwhelming firepower at the tactical level, state forces may in some cases intimidate the local population into fearing them and leaving them alone. But fear and hate are closely related. And if the local population ends up hating state forces, that works towards their strategic defeat. This is why in Northern Ireland, British troops were not allowed to return fire unless they were actually taking casualties. The Israeli military historian Martin van Creveld argues that one reason that the British Army did not lose in Northern Ireland is that it accepted more casualties than it inflicted. Now, on the surface, this may appear to be true. The number of British soldiers directly killed by the Provisional Irish Republican Army is higher than the number of IRA fighters killed by the British military. But Lynd is somewhat obscuring the nature of how the British Army was successful. An obituary for Frank Kitson lists his methods in Northern Ireland as the following: spreading black propaganda designed to undermine nationalists and Republicans, deploying psychological warfare techniques involving the torture of internees from August of 1971 onwards, establishing the Military Reaction Force, a clandestine unit of the British Army that carried out unattributable assassinations of nationalists and Republicans on the streets of Belfast and other areas in the 6 counties, infiltrating unionist and loyalist organizations to form and control death squads, counter gangs, in order to instigate and increase sectarian strife. Rather than having the British military directly fight the IRA, where the local population and the international community would inevitably side with the IRA as underdogs, Kitson arranged for funding and covert support for Protestant extremists. If the IRA fighters were killed by Protestants, this made the conflict appear much more to be a sectarian religious one rather than a national liberation struggle. Furthermore, if clandestine British Army forces assassinated IRA fighters quietly, it would be a lot harder for the local population to view it as a David and Goliath fight. As Lynd explains, one key to the mafia's success is to conceal the use of force. If an individual needs to be whacked, then it is usually done with little fanfare and in the shadows. The rule is no fingerprints. Unless there is a specific message aimed for a larger audience, people who are killed by the mafia are seldom found. This method usually requires patience. It often takes a long time for the right moment to present itself. Throughout the 1980s, Northern Ireland and Britain became filled with various Marxist-Leninist, Trotskyite, and Maoist groups that opposed the IRA as revisionist. Even though the IRA was receiving Soviet and Libyan backing, various Marxist intellectuals declared it to somehow be contrary to genuine communist thought. During the same period, the IRA became somewhat adjacent to organized crime. Of course, this was exaggerated in the press. It was probably done to some degree in order to gain protection from rival organized crime groups that were being covertly pushed by the British to work against them in exchange for protection. Here I have a picture of the IRA, right? This is IRA fighters on patrol. With the IRA fighting Protestant loyalist fanatics, facing condemnation and often violence from other Irish nationalists and communists, while also increasingly getting mixed up with drug dealers and other socially undesirable entities, the conflict made less and less sense to the population. At the same time, the United Nations and various liberal NGOs funded peacemaking efforts to bring Catholics and Protestants together. Instead of the light switch effect, David versus Goliath, the troubles in Northern Ireland became a confusing mess. The loyalty of the population, which became weary of the violence, gradually went back over to the state. When the Good Friday Agreement was signed, the IRA prisoners were released, and the bulk of the IRA laid down their arms and joined the government. A few dissident IRA groups still exist and conduct occasional attacks, but they have very little public support for their activities. The next case study, Operation Gladio. After the Second World War, the Communist Party of Italy was very popular. Its leaders had fought Hitler and Mussolini in the famous partisan brigades. The U.S. State Department in the mid-1960s assessed that the Italian Communist Party was not just the largest communist party in a non-communist country, but it was the largest political party in Western Europe, with over 1,350,000 active members. If the Italian Communist Party had won control of the parliament, this would have meant Italy leaving the NATO alliance. We now know that a special CIA program was created to prevent this from happening. It was called Operation Gladio. The CIA did everything possible to make sure that Italy never left the NATO alliance, and U.S. troops and military forces could remain in Italy to oppose the Soviet Union. The results of Operation Gladio were what was known in Italy as the Years of Lead. From the 1960s to the 1980s, Italy was plagued with political violence. The Italian Communist Party did not advocate violence. In fact, Mao Zedong had condemned the Italian Communist Party as revisionist, publishing a pamphlet called The Differences Between Comrade Togliatti and Us. The Italian Communist Party was committed to winning elections peacefully and legally, and moving to implement socialism through a coalition government in alliance with Social Democrats, peace activists, and labor unionists. The Italian Communist Party was Soviet-aligned and Soviet-funded, no doubt, and it wanted to transition Italy to leave NATO and align with the Soviet Union. But it was not an advocate of violent revolution. In order to facilitate Operation Gladio, the CIA set up the P2 Masonic Lodge, a fraternal organization that many Italian politicians, businessmen, and Catholic clergymen were involved with. The P2 Masonic Lodge worked to facilitate the assassination of Communist Party leaders. The Italian Social Movement, a group of Italians who admired Mussolini, was formed. Various armed far-right groups, such as the Armed Revolutionary Nuclei, were formed to begin killing communists. When the political crisis escalated in 1968, violence between communists and fascists intensified. Starting in the early 1970s, the Red Brigades emerged. These were young Italian communists who felt the Communist Party was revisionist and began engaging in assassinations and bombings. I have a picture of Red Brigade graffiti. There's like graffiti for the Brigate Rosse, Red Brigades. The Red Brigades were led by various dissident communist factions, such as the Communist Combat Party or the Union of Combatant Communists. The Red Brigades targeted business owners, first taking them hostage to support striking workers, often humiliating them and displaying them with degrading signs in the style of China's Cultural Revolution. They also assassinated members of the Italian social movement and other fascist groups, as well as retaliating against judges who would send their members to prison. Soon the Red Brigades began killing leaders of the Italian Communist Party, who they believed to be cooperating with the police. The Italian Communist Party leaders tried to downplay the rivalry with the Red Brigades, calling them comrades who do wrong, but it did not help. In 1978, the Italian Communist Party received a very large percentage of the vote. The Christian Democratic Party, led by Aldo Moro, a former prime minister, announced that it was in the process of making a historic deal and forming a coalition government with the communists. The Red Brigades thought the Italian communists joining a coalition government was a betrayal of Marxist-Leninist principles. The United States feared this coalition government would result in Italy leaving NATO. The Red Brigades then kidnapped and murdered Aldo Moro, and the proposed alliance didn't happen, and the Italian Communist Party never became part of the ruling coalition. Journalist Carmine Pecorelli publicly blamed the kidnapping of Aldo Moro on the CIA and Operation Gladio, and hinted that some kind of secret society was being used to keep Italy in NATO. He leaked a number of letters that Moro had written to his family and revealed that during his interrogations by the Red Brigades, Moro had told his captors it was obvious that they were being used by the CIA to block the coalition government. Pecorelli wrote that Italian government officials knew where Moro was being held, but refused to rescue him because they didn't get permission from something called Christ's Lodge in Paradise. Pecorelli was then assassinated himself, with the police suspecting the killers were part of a far-right organization, though this could never be proven. Hundreds of Red Brigade fighters who did not want to go to prison fled to France, where the French government, part of NATO, offered them sanctuary. French President François Mitterrand stated that Italian Red Brigade terrorists were welcome to live in France as long as they, quote, have broken links with the infernal machine in which they participated and have begun a second phase of their lives and have integrated into French society. Over 428 people were killed in Italy's Years of Lead, though hundreds more were injured. One of the most common tactics employed by the fascists and the Red Brigades was to shoot someone in their legs and cripple them for life, a tradition rooted in the mafia's infamous practice of kneecapping people. In 1981, the existence of the P2 Masonic Lodge and a list of members was revealed. The list included some of Italy's top political leaders, including even a few communists. The organization had been widely rumored to exist among those involved in Italian politics. The Italian Communist Party officially cut ties with the Soviet Union in 1978, becoming Euro-communist. A number of factors led to this. One factor was the increasing influence of academia among communist circles. Funding for college professors to write about Marxism and cooperation between Italian Marxist academics and French intellectuals like Louis Althusser and Jean-Paul Sartre nudged many Italian communists to have a less pro-Soviet view. American intellectual Joseph Buttigieg, the father of Pete Buttigieg, translated the prison notebooks of communist leader Antonio Gramsci and founded the International Gramsci Society, emphasizing a more cultural and less economic interpretation of Marxism. This came at the same time the CIA was covertly funding other European Marxist academics like Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, associated with the Frankfurt School, promoting their work in CIA-funded magazines like Der Monat, Paris Review, Partisan Review, and Encounter. With a rising influence from academia, discourse among Italian communists increasingly became more postmodern and anti-Soviet, equating the Soviet Union with totalitarianism in New Left thinking. In addition to increasingly liberal and postmodern tone of Italian communist discourse, the Italian Communist Party also became terrified of Red Brigade terrorism. Elected officials from the Communist Party increasingly became reliant on Italian security services for protection from the Red Brigade terrorism. In 1989, the Italian Communist Party embraced color revolutions taking place across Eastern Europe and called for dissolving the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Italian Communist Party officially liquidated. The bulk of the organization formed a new party called the Democratic Party of the Left, that was pro-NATO and aligned with the British Labour Party. A smaller, more radical group called the Communist Refoundation Party was established, made up of a variety of Trotskyites, Maoists, and others who wanted to hold on to the more radical stances associated with communism. In short, after a prolonged period of political violence that became more and more confusing, imperialism, globalism was victorious. The population became more and more weary of the violence. The main anti-NATO entity, the Communist Party, was weakened politically and ultimately collapsed. Italians left the country in big numbers during the years of lead, though migration to the United States decreased when politics became more stable during the late 80s. Much like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Italy's resistance to imperialism was pacified by making sure no light switch effect was created, making the resistance and opposition a confused mess, and making the population weary of sectarian violence. The existing state, tied to NATO and globalism imperialism, won by default. Case study number 3, Jamaica. Jamaica in the 1970s and 80s is a similar story. Jamaica was a former British colony and part of the Western imperialist financial system in the Caribbean. The island was plagued by poverty and instability, but in the atmosphere of the post-World War II wave of anti-colonial struggles, the People's National Party came to power. Prime Minister Michael Manley took office in 1972, and 2 years later declared himself to be an admirer of Fidel Castro, and announced his goal of moving Jamaica toward democratic socialism and an alliance with the Soviet Union. One of Manley's primary advisors was Donald Harris, the father of U.S. presidential candidate Kamala Harris. Here's a photograph of Michael Manley with Fidel Castro. That was the elected president, prime minister, the elected head of state, prime minister of Jamaica, who aligned with the Soviet Union and admired Fidel Castro and was trying to move Jamaica towards socialism and anti-imperialism. The drug trade had long plagued Jamaica, and the drug gangs took sides as the People's National Party, anti-imperialist and pro-Soviet, and the Jamaican Labor Party, pro-British and backed by imperialism, globalism, battled for power. Violence escalated throughout the 70s. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency was involved in supplying guns and weapons and infiltrating criminal organizations. 844 people were murdered in political violence that preceded the 1980 election. It is now a matter of public record that the infamous Shower Posse gang was provided with weapons and training by the CIA as it launched a wave of assassinations and bombings intended to support the Jamaican Labor Party. Throughout the 70s and 80s, people fled the island in large numbers to avoid the violence, migrating to the United States. The Shower Posse set up shop in the United States and got involved in operations against various criminal organizations with a black nationalist orientation, some of whom were accused of being funded by Gaddafi and the Soviet Union. In August of 1985, Jamaican families who attended a community gathering in Oakland, New Jersey, found themselves surrounded by gunfire. The crowd of over 2,000 people ran and ducked in panic as criminal organizations associated with the Jamaican Labor Party fought with criminal organizations associated with the People's National Party. 3 people were killed and 9 were wounded. In a parallel to Northern Ireland, at the same time that the U.S. government was funding armed groups and the political struggle deteriorated into gang warfare, big record companies, the United Nations, and many liberal organizations were promoting a message of peace and reconciliation. In April of 1978, Bob Marley joined hands with the leaders of both parties at the widely memorialized One Love concert, which was a plea to end the killing. And here we have, this is people in Jamaica ducking to avoid the gunfire. And this is the famous One Love concert where the leader of the Labor Party and Michael Manley of the People's National Party joined hands. Can't we all just get along, peace and love? At the same time, the U.S. government was funding gangs to murder people on the streets. They also had this bland, can't we all just get along, peace and love message. It was very strategic. Same thing they did in Northern Ireland. As the Soviet Union declined, the People's National Party became less and less anti-imperialist, and today functions as a neoliberal social democratic party. The Shower Posse and other criminal organizations, quote, non-state actors, continue to be a plague on Jamaica. In 2010, drug dealer Christopher Koch, a leader of the Shower Posse organization, waged a battle with Jamaican authorities in the hopes of avoiding extradition to the United States. On May 24th and 25th, gang members burned 2 police stations. 73 civilians were killed, along with 4 law enforcement and military personnel. Koch was eventually arrested in June and extradited to the United States, where he was sentenced to 23 years in prison for drug trafficking. Yeah, the big gangster in Jamaica was trained by the CIA, but eventually the USA extradited him and took him to prison. Frank Kitson is infamously quoted as saying, "If a fish has got to be destroyed, it can be attacked directly by rod or net. But if a rod and net cannot succeed, it is necessary to do something with the water." This quotation is probably intended to be a nod to Mao Zedong's famous quote about guerrilla warfare. The masses are the water, and the revolutionaries are the fish. Kitson's thinking is that to completely poison the atmosphere surrounding insurgents, so they have nowhere to swim and cannot get popular support. In all 3 of the conflicts above, in which the British and pro-NATO forces worked to prevent a country from breaking out of their grip, this was done. A mass anti-imperialist movement that was winning and had a base among the population was derailed by escalating a wave of confusing, theatrical, and brutal violence. Politics became too dangerous to participate in for fear of one's own safety. Politics also became extremely confusing, with groups with roughly the same stated goals and beliefs killing each other with criminal organizations playing an increasing role and lots of confusion all around. In all of these conflicts, the British and the Americans concealed their hand and did not directly attack their enemies, not wanting to create a David and Goliath scenario. Lind writes, given the mismatch between occupying troops and the local armed elements, any fighting works to the occupier's disadvantage on the all-important moral level. In addition, the societal disorder the fighting inevitably creates works to the advantage of non-state elements. In all of these situations, the quiet handing out of money and assistance to the population and manipulating various non-state actors was key. As Lind writes, what artillery and air power are in third-generation war, cash is in fourth-generation war. The infantry is most useful supporting arm. Local commanders must have a bottomless slush fund of cash. Obviously, this cash cannot be subjected to normal accounting procedures, as most will necessarily and properly be used for bribes. It is imperative that any regulations or bureaucratic obstacles to bribery are promptly changed. Furthermore, it was key to sow distrust among the various insurgent factions and play up ethnic, religious, and tribal and regional differences. Lind's handbook also writes, distinguish between captured opponents on the basis of motivation, tribe, religion, or some other basis that the local people will recognize. Treat some as honored guests and send them home while continuing to detain others. This causes suspicion and division among the opponents. These methods of preventing an anti-imperialist government from emerging and isolating and weakening an anti-imperialist movement have a pretty negative effect on a country overall. Northern Ireland, Jamaica, and Italy both experienced waves of people simply leaving to avoid the violence. All three countries experienced an overall economic deterioration due to the conflict and societal fracturing as well. Jamaica never recovered from the escalation of gang warfare in the 1970s and continues to have gang violence of a far less political nature right up to today. Many countries in Central America have a similar problem with drug gangs, narcos, most of which trace their roots back to the same era when the United States was training drug-dealing Contras to fight against communism throughout the region. The reason that all of this is relevant in a book about the 2024 murder of Brian Thompson in New York City is that these methods of counterinsurgency are obviously being utilized in the United States at this time. The forces waging the counterinsurgency in the United States are the same as those in Ireland, Jamaica, and Italy. It is the global financial system headquartered in Wall Street and London, the economic form of the British Empire, and more specifically, its military bloc, NATO, that rules the United States and is seeking to maintain control. Frank Kitson describes insurgency as three stages: subversion, terrorism, and civil war. In Kitson's understanding, if there is widespread distrust and contempt for the state, this will then lead to the emergence of organizations that work against the state. He considers this to be terrorism. If this terrorism, quote, proliferates, the result will be the state itself fracturing between sections aligned with the existing order and another side that aligns with the, quote, terrorists. This is civil war. Kitson's use of the word terrorism is quite different from the definition used by Marxists and even by most people who use the term. He considers organizations that have a mass base among the population and organize mass strikes, protests, and rebellions to demand progressive reforms to be terrorists because they are seeking to change the system, quote, by force. Regardless, Kitson's three stages of insurgency match Mao Zedong's three stages: strategic defensive, strategic equilibrium, and strategic offensive. At one point in an insurgency, The enemies of the status quo are simply engaged in public protest and spreading their ideas. What Mao Zedong called strategic defensive, Kitson calls subversion. At some point, territory is seized, mass organizations are built, alliances are made with sections of the power structure, and the revolutionary organization flourishes. This is what is called terrorism by Frank Kitson, because the revolutionary organization has power and is able to exercise it. Mao Zedong labeled this phase strategic equilibrium. Then the existing state cracks, with one side aligned with the revolutionary forces and the other side opposing them. This is what is called civil war by Frank Kitson and what Mao Zedong called strategic offensive. This is the period of the struggle in which the revolutionary organization is capable of taking power. Kitson argued that all societies are constantly existing somewhere on this scale of insurgency. In terms of Kitson's analysis, U.S. society is experiencing widespread subversion. The counterinsurgency is being waged against a very confused but increasingly angry U.S. population that opposes U.S. foreign policy, is angry with the economic deterioration of the country, and feels its freedoms are being eroded. The greatest fear is that some kind of solid block of opposition could emerge and form organizations with roots among the masses and begin to force changes and exercise power. This is what Frank Kitson calls terrorism and what Mao Zedong called strategic equilibrium. The closest thing to a solid block of opposition to NATO and the overall agenda of globalism and imperialism is Donald Trump, a politician who has been successful by giving voice to much of the outrage about these issues. John Bolton, who previously served as Trump's national security advisor, warned that the USA would pull out of NATO if Trump were to take office again. Trump's first term in office was very much in line with NATO's foreign policy goals and didn't stray very much from the status quo. Trump does seem to cater more to those with sentiments that the ruling order considers to be subversive. So this is why they do not trust him. Beneath the surface, across the United States, anti-establishment ideas are growing more popular. Libertarianism, socialism, Marxism, and a whole slew of different anti-establishment conceptions that are labeled conspiracy theories and all kinds of dissident ideas have widespread interest and support among the discontented population. The first sign that U.S. politics was shifting out of the control of the powers that be was the rise of Bernie Sanders in 2016 and the subsequent outrage at the Democrat convention in July. Sanders, long a fringe element among the Democrats, rose to be a front runner with his message of democratic socialism, calling for healthcare and education to be provided to the public free of charge. Though Sanders accepted defeat and endorsed Hillary Clinton, his supporters did not. Leaked emails showing how the Democratic Party had been internally manipulated in order to weaken Sanders intensified the outrage. The second sign that U.S. politics was out of control came in November of 2016 when Trump won the election despite mainstream media opposition that Trump would lose and predictions that Trump would lose. Trump won because the establishment seemed to be against him. Many Bernie Trump voters openly said they would have voted for Sanders if he had been the nominee, but picked Trump as he seemed more anti-establishment than Hillary Clinton. Trump's first term ended with pandemic lockdowns, widespread distrust of government mask and vaccine mandates, a wave of rioting among African Americans in opposition to police brutality, and then a riot in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, 2021, just before Trump left office. The anti-establishment sentiments that made Sanders popular and propelled Trump to win 2 elections are very much alive. The public still opposes the foreign policy, the economic deterioration, and the emerging low-wage police state. However, the counterinsurgency is in full swing and is functioning somewhat effectively and making sure that no solid opposition emerges. The counterinsurgency at this time functions as a mechanism for containing and channeling the rising anger and dissent of the population into ineffective channels and into areas deemed useful and safe by different sections of the power structure. For example, the rise of Bernie Sanders and the wave of interest in socialism among young people has been effectively channeled into a mere defense of the establishment. This was done using a wave of social media influencers called BreadTube. Various unheard of young commentators exploded into popularity across social media as the voices of socialism, boosted by mainstream media and the algorithms. They were trained by U.S. intelligence-connected deprogrammer and admitted former kidnapper Steve Hassan. Abigail Thorne, Philosophy Tube was funded by both British intelligence and George Soros. Natalie Wynn, ContraPoints, was even celebrated by Hillary and Chelsea Clinton. They all promoted a socialism that was in line with U.S. foreign policy goals and did not even present economic demands. They focused the bulk of their programming not even on advocating their vague worker cooperative or welfare state understanding of socialism, but on pounding the podium against fascism of Donald Trump and the supposed evil of tankies and Nazbols, i.e., leftists who didn't support NATO and wanted to change the prevailing order. None of these voices were connected to any existing socialist or Marxist organization, except a vague connection with Democratic Socialists of America. They all took aim at any leftist voice who spoke out of turn, most especially at Jimmy Dore's call to force the vote for Medicare for all during the pandemic. Trump's campaign became just as confused by online manipulation. QAnon became popular, with the belief that rather than demanding anything from the administration, his supporters should, quote, trust the plan. Trump was said to be waging some kind of shadow war with a secret cabal of pedophiles. This all led to a riot in which at least 26 FBI assets enabled protesters to enter the U.S. Capitol building. The result was a huge crackdown of many of the most radical Trump supporters, including leaders of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, being sent to federal prison, and widespread confusion among Trump supporters. All of William S. Lind and Frank Kitzen's tactics are being employed. Lind wrote about how cash was useful in fourth-generation warfare. Modern technology has taken this to another level. With Patreon and other social media platforms, funds can be handed out to incentivize behavior without their sources, with their source being completely concealed. The top voices among the dissident communities, be they leftists, right-wing, libertarian, or conspiracy-oriented, are all receiving hefty monthly payouts and constantly adjusting their behavior to please the anonymous donors and any demands that they make. Events like the 2023 Rage Against the War Machine rally, in which a coalition of sorts to oppose U.S. foreign policy seemed to be in the works, were immediately condemned by the top voices in all dissident spaces. Every difference, every rumor, and every suspicion among the participants was amplified to make sure the event was as small as possible, and as a result, the coalition did not last. The main focus of the events of the establishment in their counterinsurgency is on keeping subversion as merely an online hobby or fandom. All the primary voices in right-wing, libertarian, and leftist spaces insist on that and immediately line up to condemn and marginalize all real organizing or coalition building. If a solid opposition movement emerges, this could lead to a light switch effect. In our current atmosphere of distrust for the establishment, it would be perceived as a David versus Goliath scenario. As Frank Kitson warned, this subversion could soon lead to what he would deem to be terrorism, which could eventually lead to an all-out civil war against the power structure, which would never allow the country to transition out of globalism, imperialism in a peaceful way. While the counterinsurgency seems to be effective, Donald Trump still won the 2024 election by playing into subversive talking points. Public opinion is still very unhappy with the status quo. The U.S. state itself is highly disunited in how to respond to the crisis, with very solid disagreements about Ukraine, the partisan role of the FBI, Israel, and tech censorship and information control. The real fear of the powers that be is that openings created by divisions among the elite and widespread anti-establishment sentiments could manifest themselves in some kind of opposition movement with real roots among the masses. The election of Donald Trump signifies that the counterinsurgency in its current mode is insufficient. The reason the Uhuru movement was raided by the FBI in 2022, indicted and subjected to a 2-year-long legal process in federal court, is that among all this, quote, subversive forces in the United States, they have the largest mass base and influence. With their community service programs as part of their Black Power blueprint, there are hundreds of thousands of African Americans in Missouri and Florida who come into direct contact with this anti-imperialist Black revolutionary organization. If the Uhuru movement simply had a YouTube channel, they would pose no threat. They were singled out by the U.S. government because they represent the beginning of the next stage of, quote, insurgency, with a base among the population and organizations providing services to the population. The killing of Brian Thompson and its celebration across social media represents the dangerous next stage in the counterinsurgency. To prevent something like the Jamaican People's National Party, the Italian Communist Party, or the Provisional IRA, solid forces of opposition to global imperialism with a real base among the population, from emerging, the counterinsurgency is escalating toward a preemptive American years of lead. The manipulation of dissident circles through social media has been massive. A bitter, competitive atmosphere has been created. It has already become the case that if you disagree with someone, often someone who is closer to you ideologically, but somehow wrong, it is necessary to get them fired from their job, destroy their reputation online, and force all their friends to denounce them. BreadTube successfully diverted the various socialists from building a movement for socialism to instead canceling ordinary working people for being racist, sexist, homophobic, or transphobic. Often the primary target of BreadTube cancel campaigns was not simply ordinary people with right-wing views, but rather other socialists deemed to be crypto-fascists or TERFs. Libertarians spend far more time tearing down Angela McArdle, chair of the Libertarian Party, for her alleged heresy against the ideology than they do defending their own beliefs. Libertarian spaces online are dominated by various influencers who work overtime to prevent any real organizing or coalition building and focus on tearing each other down. What Sigmund Freud wrote about, the narcissism of small differences, has taken on an extreme character, where dissident circles have been effectively manipulated into being circular firing squads. The establishment itself selects who in the dissident communities gets to have the upper hand by arranging them for them to dominate social media. The selected influencers of dissident spaces take aim at various other figures within their own ideological community, most especially anyone attempting to build any real coalition or real-life activism. Dissident activity is reduced to becoming a kind of internet entertainment, with beefs, disagreements, and tea, gossip, defining conversations that become less and less about principles and more about individual loyalties and personalities. Peter Coffin has spoken extensively about fandom as the toxic reality of dissident politics in our time. But even with all of this, the dissident feelings continue. So the next stage is to bring the circular firing squad into real life, escalate to violence, and get the dissidents to start shooting, kidnapping, and bombing, poisoning the water by making it extremely violent and dangerous. Make dissident politics a space of both physical and legal danger. Most people will want to avoid getting shot or arrested and will completely avoid dissident circles. The hope is that the population will get weary of the violence and gradually de-radicalize and just accept the deteriorating conditions and injustices. As no solid opposition or movement even exists, if violence becomes a solidified trend among dissidents, it will almost immediately escalate to dissidents killing each other, just as the Red Brigades deteriorated from killing and kidnapping factory owners to murdering other communists. The dissident communities are already ideologically diverse. The game plan seems to be an enhanced version of what went on during Trump's first 4 years with Charlottesville, January 6th, Force the Vote, Black Lives Matter, etc. Trump's presidency is to be tainted by instability and unrest, and dissident spaces that believe in subversive ideas are to become increasingly toxic and physically unsafe to get involved with. The population is to become more and more weary as a result and elect a pro-NATO candidate in 2028 and become less involved in dissident spaces. In December of 2024, Luigi Mangione is being shown on television almost constantly. A documentary film about his life has been announced. Celebration of him as a hero for murdering a corporate executive in complete isolation as an act of vengeance is being blasted at full volume across social media. When Christopher Dorner went on his killing spree against police officers in 2013, Facebook shut down groups praising him and worked hard to suppress outright celebration of his killings. But in 2024, a decade later, praise for a man believed to have killed a corporate executive for political reasons is being amplified. This is being done to push dissident circles in the United States on the same path that dissidents in Northern Ireland, Italy, and Jamaica were pushed on. It is a path that will lead to a weary and traumatized population and an isolated, fractured, violent, vengeful dissident community that gradually loses influence over time. Those of us who want to rescue the United States from the unfolding nightmare of decaying globalism imperialism must think strategically. We must not play into a counterinsurgency strategy that will ultimately benefit our enemies. This is why the murder of Brian Thompson should not be celebrated. There's an odd parallel between what is written about effective counterinsurgency and what is discovered about the individual human mind. During the same period, the Cold War, the very same intelligence agencies in the United States and Britain that were overseeing counterinsurgency operations were also trying to discover the secrets of mind control. The term brainwashing was coined by Edward Hunter, writing for the Miami News in 1950. John D. Mark's groundbreaking book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, describes the origins of the term that developed into a U.S. and British intelligence obsession. Edward Hunter made up his coined word from the Chinese si now, which means to cleanse the mind, which had no political meaning in Chinese. Award-winning journalist Stephen Kinzer's book, The Poisoner-in-Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control, describes the historical context. Quote, Americans should have been able to celebrate the release of 7,200 soldiers from communist prisons after an armistice in the fighting in Korea in July of 1953. Instead, they recoiled in shock. Many prisoners, it turned out, had written statements opposing the United States or praising communism. Some had confessed to committing crimes. 21 chose to stay behind in North Korea or China. The Pentagon announced they would be considered deserters and executed if found. And this image here is with Project MKUltra, the CIA sought to develop methods of mind control. As Marx notes in his book, by the end of the Korean War, 70% of the 7,190 U.S. prisoners held in China had either made confessions or signed petitions calling for an end to the American war in Asia. 15% had fully collaborated with the Chinese, and only 5% had steadfastly resisted. Worse, an alarming number of the prisoners stuck by their confessions after they returned to the United States. They did not, as was accepted, recant when they stepped on U.S. soil. Puzzled and dismayed by the wholesale collapse of morale among POWs, American opinion leaders settled on Edwards' explanation. The Chinese had somehow brainwashed our boys. The arrogance with which American media observed the POW scandal can't be overlooked. The reality that the United States did indeed commit massive war crimes against the Korean people. The work of Bruce Cummings and other Korea scholars very well confirms that. The notion that the Korean people did not have the right to have a unified government in which the Korean Workers' Party participated alongside other parties hardly seems to morally justify the millions of deaths on the peninsula. The United States famously threatened to drop atomic bombs on China at one point during the war, and every building above 1 story tall in the northern half of Korea was destroyed. The idea that captured soldiers, seeing this from another angle, might be taken prisoner, apologize, and denounce the war that they had been sent to fight isn't hard to imagine without a huge dose of anti-communist assumptions. However, in the atmosphere of McCarthyism, the notion that some GIs may have been horrified by what they were ordered to do could not be entertained. Neither could the notion that any of the arguments of the Chinese or Korean neither could the notion that any of the arguments of the Chinese or Korean captors were logically convincing. Kinzer noted the media response and the atmosphere that led to decades of CIA research. Quote, Newsweek described them, the American POWs, as shifty-eyed and groveling. And they said they had betrayed their country in exchange for better treatment because they had fallen in love with Asian women or because of the appeal of homosexualism. Several commentators warned they represented the weakening of American masculinity and the replacement by a generation of pampered kids and mama's boys. Beyond the nation's spiritual decline and the feminization of its men, another theory emerged: brainwashing. Regardless, the result was a CIA project Bluebird, which eventually became MKUltra, which eventually became Artichoke. All of it was the U.S. intelligence community trying to figure out how the Chinese and Soviet communists were able to, quote, brainwash people, and then develop their own methods for doing it. Stephen Kinzer describes the project as a kind of tragic comedy in which attempts to recreate what they had seen in horror movies and in TV programs resulted in the CIA harming lots of innocent people. Kinzer writes, quote, two traumatic historical episodes, the testimony of Cardinal Mindszenty during his 1949 trial in Hungary and the behavior of American prisoners in Korea several years later, convinced senior CIA officers that communists had discovered the key to mind control. The stories they imbibed as children and adults made those fears seem real. Lost in the blurry borderland between the fantasy and truth of mind control, they could not bring themselves to recognize the fantasy as the product of the creative imagination. What the imagination could conceive, they believed the clandestine world could make real. MKUltra was an attempt to invent a new reality. John D. Marks described the program. The CIA built up its own elaborate brainwashing program, which, like the Chinese and Soviet versions, took its own special twist from our national character. It was a tiny replica of the Manhattan Project, grounded in the conviction that the keys to brainwashing lay in technology. The program involved a number of infamous episodes, such as Operation Midnight Climax, where the CIA set up a brothel and lured men with prostitutes to a location where they could be dosed with LSD and studied. The program also involved the agency studying the art of harassing individuals in order to induce a psychological breakdown. John D. Marks quotes one agency veteran describing how disgusted he was with the cruelty dished out to individuals in the hopes of learning how to manipulate their behavior. Quote, "That's why I couldn't even take the reading the files after a while. I was sickened at seeing people take pleasure in other people's inadequacies. First of all, it was dumb. For all the money that went out, nothing ever came back. First, you'd check to see if you could destroy a man's marriage. If you could do that, that would be enough to put a lot of stress on the individual, break him down, and then you could start a minor rumor campaign against him, harass him constantly, bump his car in traffic. A lot of it is ridiculous, but it may have a cumulative effect." Marx quotes agency insiders telling how they would capture a few teenage members of a street gang, spend some time attempting to brainwash them, and then send them to rejoin their comrades and weaken the group from within. Quote, "With gang warfare," says an MKUltra source, "you tried to get some defectors in place who would like to modify some of the group behavior and cool it. Now, get a juvenile delinquent defector was motivationally not all that different from getting a Soviet one." At the same time, the US CIA was engaged in its mind control research. MI6 was utilizing British psychiatrist William Sargent across the pond. His ruthless sleep room experiments were revealed decades later to have resulted in at least a few deaths, as he kept people asleep for months at a time, drugged as he tried to influence their minds in their sleep. William Sargent published a book called The Mind Possessed in 1973, describing what much of his research had discovered about mind control, suggestibility, and its somewhat contradictory nature. Sargent wrote, "It is not the mentally ill, but normal people who are the most susceptible to brainwashing, conversion, possession, the crisis, or whatever you wish to call it, and who in their hundreds of thousands or millions fall readily under the spell of the demagogue or revivalist, the witch doctor, the pop group, the priest, or the psychiatrist, or even, to a lesser degree, the propagandist or advertiser. At the root of this all too common human experience is a state of heightened suggestibility, of openness to suggestion and exhortations." We have a picture of William Sargent, psychiatrist William Sargent's ruthless sleep room experiments coordinated with British intelligence resulted in multiple deaths. He went on to write in the book's conclusion, "Suggestibility is, in fact, one essential characteristic of being normal. A normal person is responsive to other people around him, cares what they think of him, and is readily open to their suggestion and influence. If the great majority of people were not normally suggestible, we could not live together in society at all. We could not collaborate in any undertaking. The originators of new ideas and the founders of new systems are rarely themselves normal people. If they were, they would drop their new notions comparatively quickly in the face of hostility of their fellows. The schizophrenic and schizoid thinker is the most immune of all to outside influences dominating his ideas. His ideas come most often from inside himself and may be the product of hallucinations, delusions, and other abnormal thought processes which he experiences, which he tries to explain on the basis of further delusional thinking. During the war, schizophrenics were rarely upset by bombing, for instance, being far too preoccupied with their own inner turmoils and worries. Sargent did conclude that if you wanted someone to have a dramatic political or religious conversion, it was necessary to put them under stress. Persons of hysterical temperament are also highly suggestible. Hysterical behavior is most commonly the result of normal people breaking down under severe stresses, as was seen again and again during the war. Faith healing and spirit possession rarely happen in a calm, rational atmosphere, even as witch doctors and faith healers all know too well. Emotions must be aroused for success to be obtained. Beyond these observations on suggestibility, the CIA had roughly the same lack of real discoveries in its mind control research as MI6 did with Sargent, though John D. Marks quotes agency veterans describing results that clearly required some rather horrific methods. He wrote, "By the time MK-Ultra ended in 1963, agency researchers had found no foolproof way to brainwash another person. All experiments beyond a certain point always failed," says an MK-Ultra veteran, "because the subject jerked himself back for some reason, or the subject got amnesiac or catatonic. Agency officials found, through work like Cameron's, that they could create, quote, vegetables, but such people served no operational purpose. People could be tortured into saying anything, but no science could guarantee that they would tell the truth. How many people were turned into vegetables by CIA operatives trying to discover the secrets of mind control? How many were tortured? The bulk of the program's records were destroyed before MK-Ultra became public in the late 70s, so we will never know. It is widely understood that CIA research spread LSD onto college campuses during the 1960s, contributing to the rise of drug culture, and this is largely undisputed. The CIA was paying college students and prisoners to take LSD in order to study its effects. Some intellectuals seem to have enjoyed the experience and decided to keep using it and recruited their friends. The CIA was thoroughly disappointed in its hope that LSD could be used as a mind control drug. However, as John D. Marks quotes intelligence officials noting, in Search for the Manchurian Candidate, the drug had another effect that proved very useful. The CIA veteran describes all the colors of the rainbow growing out of the cracks in the sidewalk. He had always disliked the cracks as a sign of imperfection. But suddenly, the crack became natural stress lines that measured the vibrations of the universe. The CIA official states, "You tend to have a more global view of things. I found it awfully hard when stoned to maintain the notion, I am a U.S. citizen, my country, right or wrong. You tend to have these higher good feelings. You are more open to brotherhood of man, and you are more susceptible to the seamy sides of your own personality." I think that's exactly what happened in the 60s, but it didn't make people more communist. It just made them less inclined to identify with the U.S. They took a plague on both your houses position. The new left of the 1960s was the perfect made shield against the emergence of any mass communist movement, and the perfect vehicle for deconstructing those that did exist around the world. What was achieved on a society-wide scale in Northern Ireland, Italy, and Jamaica could also be achieved within the individual human mind. To prevent a light switch effect, to avoid a David versus Goliath scenario, as Kitson and Lind described on the battlefield, could be done intellectually and psychologically with potential dissidents. The secret to defeating communism wasn't inducing fanatical anti-communism. Instead, it was inducing a kind of weary, unenthusiastic, plague on both your houses position and getting potential dissident fanatics into a dull state of indifference with shades of gray perspective. The idea of avoiding direct confrontation to get what you want out of people is widely understood among sales and marketing researchers, as well as those who study the art of workplace management. The widely read 1937 self-help book, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie contains this anecdote about how a manager convinced his employees to wear their hard hats. George B. Johnston of Enid, Oklahoma, is the safety coordinator of an engineering company. One of his responsibilities is to ensure that employees wear their hard hats whenever they are on the job in the field. He reported that whenever he came across workers who were not wearing hard hats, he would tell them with a lot of authority about the regulation and that they must comply. As a result, he would get sullen acceptance, and often, after he left, the workers would remove the hats. The next time, he decided to try a different approach. The next time he found some of the workers not wearing their hats, he asked them if the hats were comfortable and if they fit properly. Then he reminded them in a pleasant voice that the hat was designed to protect them from injury and suggested that it always be worn on the job. The result was increased compliance with the regulation, with no resentment or emotional upset. You will find examples of the futility of criticism bristling on 1,000 pages of history. But what the CIA discovered about LSD and how it reduced its own officers to feel neutrality toward the American government and no longer be annoyed by cracks in the sidewalk points to something of a far higher caliber. It explains a huge amount about U.S. art, culture, and academic discourse, particularly in regard to notions that are considered left. The main way anti-establishment sentiments are contained among the U.S. population, the main intellectual counterinsurgency technique used today seems to be inducing lassitude. What is lassitude? Merriam-Webster defines it in two ways. First, a condition of weariness or debility. And second, a condition characterized by lack of interest, energy, or spirit. Right here, we find the key to maintaining control, and we see the aim of the power structure when it perceives rising discontent. The goal is not to induce compliance through absolute terror of punishment and repression. In the long term, that will result in resentment. The goal is not to change our minds and convince us that the society we live in is acceptable. This is hardly possible, even under ideal conditions, as people always have something to be dissatisfied with. And especially as conditions worsen across the United States, it is a completely unrealistic goal. The power structure of the United States and the globalist imperialist system has devised a number of ways to induce lassitude, make us passionless, without energy, without spirit, weary, debilitated, and thus not an obstacle in carrying out their transition to a low-wage police state and moves toward war. The Congress for Cultural Freedom program of the CIA brought forth various thinkers who fixated on the notion of fascism. Rather than using the economic definition of fascism, pioneered by R. Palm Dutt and other great communists during the Depression, that fascism was heavy-handed state control used to impose degrowth to stabilize the economy amid a crisis of overproduction, the Frankfurt School cultural Marxists redefined fascism. Susan Sontag's New York Review of Books essay, Fascinating Fascism, insisted that German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl's photo exhibit of African tribes was fascist because it contained certain themes. Right? Here's one of the photos they said was fascist. This is a fascist photo, according to the CIA. Right? This is one of Leni Riefenstahl's photos of the African Nuba tribe. Susan Sontag wrote, fascism stands for an ideal, or rather ideals that are persistent today under other banners. The ideal of life as art, the cult of beauty, the fetishism of courage, the dissolution of alienation in ecstatic feelings of community, the family of man. Although the Nuba are black, not Aryan, Riefenstahl's portrait of them evokes some of the larger themes of Nazi ideology: the contact between the clean and the impure, the incorruptible and the defiled, the physical and the mental, and the joyful and the critical. Sontag went on to explain what she thought the fascist aesthetic was. Quote, extravagant effort, the endurance of pain, the massing of groups of people, the turning of people into things, the multiplication and replication of things, and grouping of things around an all-powerful hypnotic leader or force. The fascist dramaturgy centers on the orgiastic transactions between mighty forces and their puppets, uniformly garbed and shown in swelling numbers. Its choreography alienates between ceaseless motion and a congealed, static, virile posing. Fascistic art glorifies surrender. It exalts mindlessness. It glamorizes death. Mass athletic demonstration, a choreographed display of bodies, is valued activity in totalitarian countries. And the art of the gymnast, now so popular in Eastern Europe, also evokes recurrent features of fascist aesthetics: the holding in or confining of force, military precision. In both fascist and communist politics, the will is staged publicly in the drama of leader and chorus. According to Sontag, a mass movement of any kind, in which people are pulling together to work for a cause and feeding off each other's energy, encouraging each other to be stronger and moving in coordination, is inherently fascist. The optimistic energy it gives off, we must assume, is also fascist. Hannah Arendt echoes these sentiments in her writings on totalitarianism. Her piece, Eichmann in Jerusalem, focuses on how the Nazi war criminal was an ordinary man who had been part of the YMCA before he joined the Hitler Youth. The message is, on the surface, about nonconformity. However, when you dig a little deeper, the message is much darker. The evils of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust are not rooted in the breakdown of capitalism, but rather the inherent barbaric and cruel nature of human beings. The piece is intended to warn against the danger of any kind of mass movement in which the inherent cruel and evil rabble, with their banality of evil, can be unleashed. Theodor Adorno's authoritarian personality comes to similar conclusions, arguing that the rise of Hitler was rooted in certain flaws in the human spirit, namely the tendency of people to believe that right and wrong exist, the light switch effect, David versus Goliath, and their ability to join some kind of mass movement and subordinate themselves to it in order to advance a cause they believe is right. The underlying message of all the New Left intellectuals, promoted by the CIA with their work published in Partisan Review, Paris Review, Der Monat, and Encounter magazines, subsidized by the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program, is that passion, mass movements, and belief in truth are very dangerous. From the perspective of the CIA-funded New Left, the ideal state of being is lassitude. If one becomes a partisan believer, a passionate activist for a cause, you are either a sucker and fool, or worse, a brown shirt Eichmann in the making. Postmodernism, the philosophical perspective of the New Left, rejects the notion that grand narratives of human society exist and derides all such ideologies and systems of thought as totalitarian. Instead, it celebrates deconstruction, i.e., taking apart such movements and deflating the passion and fanaticism that comes with them, inducing lassitude. At the same time that the CIA was funding these intellectuals, it was also funding abstract art. The CIA intentionally worked to counter social realism with abstract expressionism. The CIA funded the work of Jackson Pollock, famous for splattering paint onto a canvas. Michael Newbury, who has taught at Otis College of Art and Design, writes, quote, "The CIA and the Congress for Cultural Freedom used museums, philanthropists, foundations, magazines, both popular and literary, artists, musicians, critics, and intellectuals for their propaganda. Their stated aim was to win the cultural Cold War against the USSR. Anything that was anti-communist was unimpeachable. Their idea was to promote new American art, literature, and music with the slant that it represented freedom. This art, specifically abstract art, broke fundamentally with European and Russian art. The CIA's intellectuals might not have known that they were subverting humanity by rejecting cultural values of Western civilization. There are films of Pollock splashing and dripping paint without any hesitation on a canvas laid flat on the ground. I remember watching one of these films as an 8 or 9-year-old child in elementary school, an indoctrination that still makes me sick. These films were made to give the impression of a passionate genius at work by dignifying a pissing-like gesture without thought, perception, or heart. Some have equated this vomiting, but don't laugh or dismiss this statement, as there are contemporary postmodern artists who swallow colored liquid and then literally vomit onto canvases, consequently bypassing all aesthetic knowledge, emotion, or perception. The CIA PSYOP began promoting Pollock was to send the message that genius is a blustering, nihilistic, crazed artist who is compelled to do senseless acts. They succeeded in confusing the hell out of the general public by undermining their sense that art should be knowable and inspiring. The CIA knew and was threatened by the knowledge that real art was the linchpin that empowers humans to feel the full power of their combined senses, thoughts, and emotions. Their evil psyop was to convince people that passion without reason or reality is genius. The bigger the farce, the more they can get away with it. Through using abstract art, the CIA would drive a psychological wedge through the soul, not only of Americans, but humanity as well. A Harvard-educated art blogger named Nancy Hills gives a defense of Jackson Pollock and similar abstract art, which she admits is ugly. She writes, quote, "I believe that ugly paintings threaten us because they're unfamiliar, unruly, and emerge unbidden without our consent. They subvert our need for control. It's like experiencing a mutation, causing unforeseeable consequences. They're unpredictable, unfamiliar, unrecognizable, and different than our recent work." And here is a picture of Jackson Pollock with one of his paintings. The CIA promoted the work of Jackson Pollock, seeing abstract art as an alternative to the subversive themes and emotions found in social realism. In essence, Nancy Hills and Michael Newbury agree. Abstract art makes us feel scattered, lost, not in control, defeated, and unable to change the world around us. Abstract art puts us in a negative, defeated place of feeling disempowered. While at first we may panic if such an emotional state is induced or feel angrily insulted, after a while we accept it. The long-term result of feeling, quote, unbidden without our consent, experiencing a mutation, and having our need for control subverted for an extended period is a feeling of being psychologically defeated and bitterly accepting it. Lassitude. Rather than presenting the world as one full of contradictions and challenges, with an energizing battle between right and wrong taking place before us, in which we can choose to be active participants, Abstract art leads us to see the world as a mass of randomness and disappointment, inconsistency, in which we are more or less powerless. This, of course, matches the postmodernist philosophy and its understanding of the universe, which was labeled by George Lukács as philosophical irrationalism. Michael Newbury's reflection on the films he was shown of Jackson Pollock speaks volumes. These films were made to give the impression of a passionate genius at work by dignifying a pissing-like gesture without thought, perception, or heart. The defeated mindset created by abstract art celebrates irrational, emotional behavior, lashing out with no clear aim or goal as genius. Yes, in the minds of those with no conception of a real mass movement and no belief that we could create a society where healthcare is available to all, the idea of Luigi Mangione killing a billionaire CEO, inscribing political messages on the bullets, and composing a manifesto about vengeance and resentment, giving voice to the lingering anger and disappointment found throughout society, must indeed sound like an amazing art project. The media is all too happy to give nonstop coverage to this pessimistic Joker movie that appears to be playing out in real life. Giving publicity to Mangione, presented as the pretty-faced tragic hunger artist who displays the widespread negative emotions with an ugly act of cathartic violence with no stated demands or goals, is very safe. It boosts all the negative emotions, the bitterness, the feelings of being defeated, the desire to cathartically lash out with a lack of real goals, all the ugly components of an ugly painting, all necessary to induce a psychological state of lassitude among dissidents in the long term. Conditions are getting worse. We all feel bad. We all feel like punching somebody or maybe even shooting somebody. Mangione did it so we can celebrate him for making our bitter complaints heard without building any movement for change or even putting forward any demands or even teaching us anything about the healthcare system or the unfolding crisis that we did not already know. We have a new anti-hero in the cable news cycle. We can give a bitter grin and say, somebody killed one of the bastards, good for them. We can then go back to observing the negativity all around us, feeling completely powerless, and resuming our usual state of lassitude. American singer-songwriter Roger Miller released a humorous novelty song in 1964. He sang, "I hear tell you're doing well, good things have come to you. I wish I had your happiness, and you had a do-wacka-do, wacka-do, 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 wacka-do. They tell me you're running free, your days are never blue. I wish I had your good luck charm, and you had a do-wacka-do, wacka-do, 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 wacka-do." Socialism is largely considered in the American mind to be a movement based on jealousy. I was taught in elementary school that socialism and communism were, quote, everyone getting paid the same. Socialism is widely understood in the American mind to be, quote, the redistribution of wealth, or moves to eradicate, quote, income inequality. It's not surprising that in a culture that values hard work, social mobility, and individual initiative, it is viewed in a very negative light. However, if one reads the work of Karl Marx or even other socialist thinkers who preceded him, one will find calls not for equality of income, but the contrary. One will instead find calls for rational planning and centralization of the means of production for the purpose of greatly expanding productive forces. The Communist Manifesto, for example, never calls for equality of wages or redistribution of income, beyond vague references to an income tax system. The communist revolution is described by Marx this way, quote, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle for democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. The problem with capitalism, Marx explains, is that it is unable to sustainably increase living standards and instead creates frequent gluts where poverty is created by abundance. It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put the existence of bourgeois society on trial, each time more threateningly. And these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously creative productive forces, are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if famine, universal war of devastation had cut off nearly every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. Why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, and too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the developments of bourgeois property, and on the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered, and so soon they overcome these fetters. They bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does bourgeois society get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other, by the conquest of new markets and the more thorough exploitation of old ones. That is to say, paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means by which crises are prevented. The idea, according to Marx, is that once the means of production are centralized, economic growth can continue without any restrictions as technology advances. The level of wealth and abundance in society can greatly increase. As Engels puts it in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, but once their nature is understood, they can, in the hands of producers working together, be transformed from master demons into willing servants. The difference is that between the destructive force of electricity and lightning in the storm and electricity under the command of the telegraph and the Voltaire arc, the difference between a conflagration and a fire working in the service of man. With this recognition, at last, of the real nature of the productive forces of today, the social anarchy of production gives place to a social regulation of production upon a definite plan and according to the needs of the community and of each individual. In fact, Marx makes clear that his vision of a world without classes or inequality is only possible once rational planning of the means of production has created vast abundance. Marx specifically opposed the notion of equality of income, even in a socialist society, saying in Critique of the Goethe Program, but one man is superior to another man, physically or mentally, and supplies more labor in the same time, or can labor for a longer time, and labor to serve as a measure must be defined by its duration or intensity. Otherwise, it ceases to be a standard of measurement. This equal right is an unequal right of unequal labor. He went on to make clear that equality could only be achieved when growth has been unleashed to create a huge amount of wealth. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving and subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, and after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. The notion of rational planning of the means of production, building up productive forces with a planned economy to eradicate scarcity and create a stateless, classless world on the basis of vast abundance, is completely contrary to what is widely believed by American socialists and communists. On April 28, 2020, leftist filmmaker Michael Moore touted his new climate change themed documentary, Planet of the Humans, by explaining that the problem with capitalism was its continued generating of wealth. We're supposed to need more. This is killing the planet. We need to stop to say, do we have enough? When is enough? Enough. Actually, I think the word enough is the dirtiest word in capitalism, because there's not supposed to be any such thing as enough, because we're told we need more, and companies punished by Wall Street if they don't do more and grow more. Growth is the death of us. Marx spent his entire life showing that capitalism did not create endless wealth. Rather, it had a boom-bust cycle and frequent gluts of overproduction or value crisis. And this problem was exacerbated by technology creating a falling rate of profit. All this necessitated centralization and rational planning of the means of production, so growth and technological advancement could move ahead, no longer restrained by the irrationality of the market. However, this understanding is nowhere to be found among American leftists who celebrate the murder of Brian Thompson. In their worldview, capitalism is greed and wanting more, and this is an inherent flaw in humanity. These are not the views of Marx or any 20th century communist government. The entire purpose of the 5-year plans and mass industrialization campaigns was to create economic growth. The Communist Party of China obsesses over economic growth and has raised 800 million people out of poverty and created the second largest economy on earth. As Dugan explained in The Last War of the World Island, starting in the 1970s, communist groups began to function as caricatures of themselves, repeating stereotyped propaganda cliches of the assigned to them by their enemies, and functioning in opposition to actual socialist planning in the USSR and China, while serving the Atlanticist international order. Instead of strengthening its influence in global leftist movements according to geopolitical interest, the USSR adopted those propaganda cliches that had been implanted into this movement by pro-capitalist bourgeois powers interested in weakening the civilization of the land and strengthening the sea civilization. The representatives of the Fourth International, the Trotskyists, played a special role in this. Already radical opponents of Stalin and his policy of building socialism in one country, Trotskyites made the USSR their main enemy. And in this fight with the USSR, they joined with all the powers they could, including those they considered their class enemies. Hatred toward USSR and Stalin became a main feature of Trotskyism and led many of its representatives to side with the liberal camp and join the ranks of more consistent and more radical Atlanticists. These groups contributed heavily to tearing the international left and, more importantly, the communist movement away from the USSR beginning in the 1970s. Because of these processes, the USSR's network of influence in countries outside of direct Soviet control was undermined, weakened, and partially removed from the coordinating control of Moscow. The views of leftists who oppose capitalism because, quote, there's never enough, and growth is really the death of us, are the views of Margaret Sanger after she denounced Marxism and embraced neo-Malthusianism and established the Birth Control League. Sanger condemned Marxism, writing, quote, no true solution is possible, to continue this analogy, until the worker is awakened to the realization that the roots of his malady lie deep in his own nature, his own organism, his own habits. To blame everything upon the capitalist and the environment produced by capitalism is to focus attention upon merely one of the elements of the problem. The Marxian too often forgets that before there was a capitalist, there was exercised the unlimited reproductive activity of mankind, which produced the first overcrowding, the first want. This goaded humanity into industrial frenzy, into warfare and theft and slavery. Capitalism has not created the lamentable state of affairs in which the world now finds itself. It has grown out of them, armed with the inevitable power to take advantage of our swarming, spawning millions. These ideas that Margaret Sanger and her wealthy financiers, who sponsored the Birth Control League, put forward in opposition to Marxism, have become synonymous with Marxism, socialism, communism, and leftism in the public mind. Furthermore, these ideas do not oppose capitalism. They oppose growth. They oppose the expansion of the population, the increasing of consumption, and the raising of living standards. If growth is bad, we should, of course, embrace lassitude. And why not be bitter at individual wealthy CEOs with lots of money? After all, in this limited resources worldview, wealth and the creation of wealth is inherently bad. The anti-growth, anti-human, bitter, envious, vengeance-oriented, and overall pessimistic mindset that is going to lead a person to live a fruitful, the anti-growth, anti-human, bitter, envious, vengeance-oriented, and overall pessimistic mindset is not going to lead a person to live a fruitful, happy, or prosperous life. It's rather going to induce a huge amount of frustration, bitterness, which may flare up at times into rage and acts of murder, but ultimately induces lassitude. In the early 1900s, one of the most popular socialist writers and speakers was a friend of Eugene Debs named Wallace D. Wattles. And here's a picture of him, Wallace D. Wattles. Wattles ran for office on a socialist platform and gave two speeches that were widely circulated as pamphlets, arguing that Jesus Christ's teachings were in line with socialist thought prior to his death in 1911. Wattles was a Christian socialist and a friend of Eugene Debs, as well as a significant contributor to the New Thought movement, a philosophy that emphasized the power of personal thought, personal growth, and spiritual principles to achieve success. Long before Norman Vincent Peale wrote about the power of positive thinking, Wallace Wattles introduced these ideas in The Science of Getting Rich, a seminal work that remains influential today. In his book, which emphasized the importance of maintaining an optimistic and growth-oriented perspective, he said, in very socialistic terms, that the road to happiness and success lies in cultivating the very opposite mindset one finds in modern leftists. He wrote, "A seed dropped into the ground springs into activity, and in the act of living produces 100 more seeds. Life, by living, multiplies itself. It is forever becoming more. It must do so if it continues to be at all. Intelligence is under the same necessity for continuous increase. Every thought we think makes it necessary for us to think another thought. Consciousness is continually expanding. Every fact we learn leads us to learn of another fact. Knowledge is continually increasing. Every talent we cultivate brings to mind the desire to cultivate another talent. We are subject to the urge of life, seeking expression, whichever drives us on to know more, to do more, and to be more. In order to know more, do more, and be more, we must have more. And we must have things to use, for we learn and do and become only by using things. We must get rich so that we can live more. The desire for riches is simply the capacity for larger life seeking fulfillment. Every desire is the effort of an unexpressed possibility to come into motion. It is power seeking to manifest which causes desire. That which makes you want more money is the same as that makes the plant grow. It is life seeking fuller expression. As someone who advocated for central planning of the means of production, Wattles urged his readers even to think of the capitalist ruling class in a very different way than one has come to expect from socialists in our time, who preach jealousy and vengeance and find satisfaction in the killing of Brian Thompson. He wrote, "Men of the plutocratic type who become very rich do so sometimes purely by their extraordinary ability on the plane of competition, and sometimes they unconsciously relate to themselves to substance and its great purposes and movements for general racial upbuilding through industrial evolution. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, etc., have all been unconscious agents of the supreme in the necessary work of systematizing and organizing productive industry. And in the end, their work will contribute immensely toward the increased life for all. Their day is nearly over. They have organized production and will soon be succeeded by the agents of the multitude who will organize the machinery of distribution. The multimillionaires are like monster reptiles of the prehistoric era, but the same power which produced them will dispose of them." Wattles argued that socialism was the inevitable result of society's march toward greater abundance, but it could only be achieved when the working class was awakened to an abundance mindset. So the factory workers, either as individuals or as a class, are not deprived of opportunity. The workers are not being kept down by their masters. They're not being ground by the trusts and combinations of capital. As a class, they are where they are because they do not do things in a certain way. If the workers of America chose to do so, they could follow the example of their brothers in Belgium and other countries and establish great department stores and cooperative industries. They could elect men of their own class to office and pass laws favoring the development of cooperative industries. In a few years, they could take peaceable possession of the entire industrial field. The working class may become the master class whenever they begin to do things in a certain way. The law of wealth is the same for them as it is for others. This they must learn. They will remain where they are as long as they continue to do things in a certain way. Wattles put forward a conception of understanding the struggle of workers for a better life in an optimistic rather than bitter and resentful way, seeing it as the natural process of human growth and evolution, not a bitter struggle for power. Quote, "Nature is a great advancing presence, working beneficently for the happiness of all. All things in nature are good. She has no evil. She is not complete, for creation is still unfinished. But she is going on to give man even more bountifully than she has given him in the past. Nature is a partial expression of God, and God is love. She is perfect but not complete. So of human society and government. What though there are trusts and combination of capital and strikes and lockouts and so on? All these things are part of the forward movement. They are incidental to the evolutionary process of completing society. When it is complete, there will be no more of these inharmonies, but it cannot be completed without them. J.P. Morgan is as necessary to the coming social order as the strange animals of the age of reptiles were to the life of the succeeding period. Just as these animals were perfect after their kind, so Morgan is perfect after his kind. Behold, it is all very good. See society, government, and industry as being perfect now and as advancing rapidly toward being complete. Then you will understand that there is nothing to fear, no cause for anxiety, and nothing to worry about. Never complain of any of these things. They are perfect. This is the very best possible world for the stage of development man has reached. This will sound like rank folly to many, and perhaps to most people. What, they will say, are not child labor and the exploitation of men and women in filthy and unsanitary factories evil things? Are not saloons evil? Do you mean to say that we shall accept all these things and call them good? Child labor and similar things are no more evil than the way of living and the habits and practices of cave dwellers were evil. His ways were those of the savage stage of man's growth. And for that stage, they were perfect. Our industrial practices are those of the savage stage of industrial development. And they are also perfect. In line with this worldview, Wattles put forward a very different perspective on what kind of art and what kind of messages should be relayed to the world by those who want to see a socialist world. He wrote, "The more you talk and think about your hard times, the more you will be inclined to seek some mental narcotic to dull the edge of your suffering, and the longer you will suffer. No surer way to keep the masses poor can be devised than continuing to write and talk about their poverty. Talk about the good time coming. The good time is coming, and the rapidity of its coming is in exact proportion to the number of people who think about it and talk about it. Instead of going about showing horrible pictures of the condition of those who live in tenements, go about showing beautiful pictures of the conditions of those who will live in the coming city. If you can inspire one person to go out and work for the coming city, you have done more good than you can by sending 10 people out with slaves and plasterers to relieve existing distress. Instead of crusading against child labor and bad factory conditions, tell the working people what splendid conditions they will have when they wake up and begin operating the industries for themselves. The masses are not in bondage to anything but ignorance and intellectual laziness. They can have what they will if they begin to think." While Wattles was an idealist rather than a materialist, and with acknowledgement that those seeking a great man to follow could in theory lean too far in and ignore the struggles of working people or the obstacles and contradictions that must be overcome, one must admit that the statues found in the Moscow subways, the murals one sees in Venezuela, or the architecture of Pyongyang, in these works of art, the sentiments put forward by Wallace D. Wattles are quite prescient. And the artistic school that the CIA looked to push against with abstract expressionism, in socialist realism, we do not see grunge, dirt, poverty, or calls for cathartic vengeance. Likewise, we do not see the bitterness and lassitude that eventually comes from it. Instead, we see a glowing hope, the glorification of collective strength and energy. When we look at this art, we do not feel powerless, but rather we feel we can join this exciting project to build a brave new world. We feel emboldened, awakened, and energized. It should be no surprise that this ideal of life as art, the cult of beauty, the fetishism of courage, the dissolution of alienation, and ecstatic feelings of community is something many millions of our tax dollars have been spent trying to eradicate. It shouldn't be shocking that hundreds and hundreds of pages have been written by CIA-backed leftist intellectuals and academics inoculating us against this kind of message and the feelings it evokes as fascist. And that's the end of chapter 3. And I couldn't end it without showing some beautiful socialist art. That's the Worker and Kolokov Woman Monument, originally constructed for the Paris World's Fair of 1937 and moved to Moscow. Absolutely beautiful. And this is the African Renaissance Memorial, or the African Renaissance Monument, constructed to commemorate the independence of Senegal by artists from North Korea. And this is the mural that's found in the International Longshore Warehouse Union Hall in Hawaii, celebrating the striking dock workers. And this is the painting of John Brown called Tragic Prelude. It's found in the Kansas State Capitol building. Look at that. Look at that. Makes you feel differently now, doesn't it? So I might as well read you the conclusion of the book. I might as well finish the book because we're very close to the end. And the conclusion, the last section, the conclusion is the end of the book. So here we go. This is the conclusion. Jeremiah, John Brown, and the Future of America. Just 2 weeks after the killing of Brian Thompson, New York City witnessed another brutal murder in broad daylight. On December 23rd, a woman riding the subway on the F train near Coney Island was set on fire. Videos circulated online showing the woman, her body engulfed in flames, as a sadistic attacker looked on in satisfaction. The victim, apparently a homeless woman who was sleeping on the train, has not yet been named. The alleged attacker has been arrested. This horrific incident further underscores how deeply unhealthy United States society has become. People increasingly fear for their safety. As society grows less stable, living standards decline, and the ruling class remains at odds with itself. In such an atmosphere, the traditional leftist aesthetic of revolt and appealing to people's libidinal desire for chaos is unlikely to succeed. I encourage those who oppose globalism and imperialism and who seek to build a new America to draw inspiration from another source. In the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, one can find a text that has profoundly influenced American history and culture and remains highly relevant today. The text is the book of Jeremiah, the transcribed words of the weeping prophet, revered by Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. Ancient Israel, like all societies, was held together by a social contract and a corresponding ideology. For Israel, the social contract was the Torah, and the ideology was the religion established by Moses and Abraham. However, during Jeremiah's time, Israeli society increasingly strayed from this social contract as the gap between the rich and poor widened. The rich exploited loopholes to entrap the poor, using them as slave labor to build extravagant mansions. Widows and orphans and others whom the Torah mandated should be cared for were left to suffer in hunger. Jeremiah, not a priest but a common man, gifted with the poetic and charismatic speech, began to sound the alarm. For among my people are found wicked men. They lay wait as he that seeth snares. They set a trap and they catch men. As a cage is full of birds, so their houses are full of deceit. Therefore they have become great and waxen rich. They are waxen fat. They shine, yea, they overpass the deeds of the wicked. They judge not the cause of the fatherless, yet they prosper, and the right of the needy do they not judge. Shall I not visit for these things, saith the Lord? Shall not my soul be avenged on such a nation as this? A wonder and horrible thing is committed in this land. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests bear rule by their means, and my people love to have it so. And will it not do ye in the end thereof? That's Jeremiah 5:26-31. Is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord. Jeremiah 7:11. And this is a painting of Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, from 1844. Horace Vernet's painting of weeping prophet Jeremiah. While the rich ignored the needs of the poor to enrich themselves, they increasingly engaged in pagan rituals at temples dedicated to the horned deity Baal. At Baal's altars, the wealthy Israelites held sexual orgies and burned infant children as sacrifices, hoping to increase their fortunes. The sin of Judah is written with a pen of iron and with a point of a diamond. It is graven upon the hearts of the table and upon the horns of your altars. Whilst their children remember their altars and their groves by the green trees upon the high hills, O my mountain in the field, I will give thy substance, all thy treasure to thy spoil, and thy high places for sin, throughout all thy borders. And thou, even thyself, shall discontinue from thine heritage that I gave thee, and I will cause thee to serve thine enemies in the land which thou knowest not. For ye have kindled a fire in mine anger, which shall burn forever. That's Jeremiah 17:1-4. Because they have forsaken me, and they have estranged this place, and have burned incense unto other gods, whom they nor their fathers have known, nor the kings of Judah, and have filled this place with the blood of innocents. They have also built in high places of Baal to burn their sons with fire for burnt offerings unto Baal, which I have commanded thee not, nor spake it, neither came into my mind. That's Jeremiah 19:1-5. Jeremiah warned that if these practices continued and the injustice persisted, Israel would face divine punishment and conquest. However, if the people returned to the social contract, the kingdom would endure and resist invasion. For if ye thoroughly amend your ways and doings, if ye thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if ye oppress not the stranger and the fatherless and the widow, and shed not innocent blood in this place, neither walk after other gods to your hurt, then I will cause you to dwell in this place, in the land that I gave your fathers forever and ever. Jeremiah 7:5-7. Jeremiah created a mass movement of working people throughout Israel, calling for a religious revival and repentance. He condemned the rich for their crimes and demanded that the social contract be restored and that justice be delivered. Standing in front of the temple in Jerusalem, he warned that if the nation did not repent, the temple would be destroyed by a foreign army. And by the way, this is a picture of the sacrifices to the horned deity Baal, the horned god. They burned their infants. Right? That's them offering up a baby they're about to sacrifice to Baal. King Josiah, himself from a wealthy class, recognized the danger posed by his peers' actions. Hoping to restrain them and hold the nation together, Josiah gave Jeremiah and his movement his blessing. However, after Josiah's death, his successor opposed Jeremiah, and the priesthood moved to suppress him as a heretic and a false prophet. Jeremiah was flogged and placed in a pillory outside the temple. Then Pashur smote Jeremiah the prophet and put him in stocks that were in the high gate of Benjamin, which was by the house of the Lord. Jeremiah 22. Amid his persecution, Jeremiah lamented to the Lord. He admitted that he had tried to suppress his prophetic voice to avoid suffering, but God's word burned within him like a fire, compelling him to speak. O Lord, thou hast deceived me, and I was deceived. Thou art stronger than I, and hast prevailed. I am in derision daily. Everyone mocketh me. For since I spake, I cried out. I cried violence and spoil, because the word of the Lord was made reproach unto me, and a derision daily. And then I said, I will not mention him, nor speak any more his name. But his word was in mine heart as a burning fire, shut up within my bones. And I was weary with foreboding, and I could not stay. Jeremiah 27:9. Jeremiah endured imprisonment, public ridicule, and estrangement from his family. He spent 40 years preaching repentance, building a movement, and facing relentless persecution. Ultimately, his warnings proved true. The kingdom was invaded and conquered by Babylon. The temple was destroyed, and the people were exiled for 70 years. Although Jeremiah's message largely fell on deaf ears, his legacy inspired future prophets like John the Baptist and even Christ himself. His fiery denunciations of corruption, idolatry, and injustice continue to resonate today. All of those events and the rhetoric from thousands of years ago are particularly relevant because of the history of the United States and the role of religion. The United States originated as 13 colonies in North America. These colonies were largely populated by religious dissenters, reflecting a trend in British political and religious life that emerged in the lead up to the English Civil War. In 1649, the emerging capitalist class, represented by Parliament, clashed with the king and the aristocracy. The Church of England served as the main entity through which the countryside aristocrats and King Charles I drew their legitimacy. Consequently, the urban capitalists of London and other cities fomented a wave of fanatical Protestantism that viewed the Church of England as a stale, bureaucratic institution imitating Catholicism. Various street preachers and rabble-rousers formed a variety of sects that rallied against the church and the outdated feudal order, which they felt disregarded the rights of man. Groups like the Quakers, Ranters, Levelers, Puritans, Muggletonians, and others formed the base of support for the new model army. When the Parliament and the king went to war, Oliver Cromwell, a fanatical Protestant, emerged to lead the Parliament to victory in the English Civil War. This is Oliver Cromwell, the Protestant fanatic who took power in the English Civil War. The English Civil War, much like the French Revolution or the German Revolution of 1848, mobilized peasants and the working class to dismantle the old order. In one notable instance at St. George's Hill, a religious sect called the Diggers established a socialist cooperative and announced their intention to abolish private property on religious grounds. King Charles was ultimately beheaded by Oliver Cromwell for claiming a divine right to rule, which was deemed heretical. And this is a famous picture, a sketch of the Diggers. And it had their leader, "England is not a free people till the poor that have no land have free allowance to dig and labor the common." And that was the Diggers uprising, the socialist uprising that was created during the English Civil War by the Diggers. Cromwell ruled England as a bourgeois revolutionary and religious fanatic. However, after his death, the rich and powerful sought to temper the radicalism that had brought him to power. Bourgeois property relations were solidified, and the English ruling class sought to reconcile with the aristocracy that had fled to France. Charles II, the son of the executed king, was restored to the throne with a new constitutional restriction on his power. Seeking stability, Charles II famously ordered the confiscation of firearms from religious dissenters, aiming to avoid his father's fate. As religious dissenters faced suppression by the English state, many began migrating to the United States. The 13 colonies, populated by radical Protestants, sought to create God's kingdom on earth in a new land. The United States emerged as a country due to conflicting interests between British bankers who controlled the empire and the emerging colonial economy. The Boston Tea Party, the battles of Lexington and Concord, and the Declaration of Independence all stemmed from disputes over the economic future of the colonies. The colonists sought development, westward expansion, and rising living standards, while the British monopolies viewed the colonies primarily as trading hubs within their sea-based global free trade empire. A mass movement of religious revivalism known as the Great Awakening swept through the colonies, setting the stage for the revolution. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards emphasized repentance and drew sharp contrast between the colonists' religious fervor and the corruption of English society. This revivalism laid the groundwork for the American Revolution and the eventual establishment of the United States. The U.S. Constitution was only ratified after the addition of the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, which protected religious freedom. This provision reflected the diverse religious views within the colonies and the need to prevent minority religions from being suppressed. After the Revolution, the United States contained two distinct economic systems: the emerging industrial economy of the northern urban centers and the small farmers or free soilers, and the slave-based economy of the South. The British became the primary financial backers of the Confederacy, relying on it as a source of cheap cotton for their textile industry. The U.S. Civil War, often called the Second American Revolution, was preceded by the Second Great Awakening, a wave of religious fervor opposing slavery. Rooted in the language of Jeremiah, this movement called for national repentance, justice for the oppressed, and an end to the sinful institution of slavery. Tent revivals and other aspects of American Protestantism trace their roots to this period. Hymns like Amazing Grace were written by a repentant former slave trader, became anthems of the abolitionist cause. The analogy of repentance, turning the ship around, applied not only to individuals, but to the nation as a whole. Key events like John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Nat Turner's slave revolt, the abolitionist movement, and Abraham Lincoln's rise culminated in the overthrow of slavery. Harriet Tubman led an army of freed slaves to liberate plantations along the Combahee River, while figures like Horace Greeley, a Christian socialist, championed abolition and social reform. During the Civil War, Lincoln recognized the importance of labor unions and revolutionary activists as allies. German communists who had fled after the failed 1848 revolution, waving red flags and singing revolutionary songs, formed regiments like the Ohio 9th Infantry. Karl Marx's International Working Men's Association held a rally in Manchester, England, to support Lincoln's struggle against slavery. In response, Lincoln praised their solidarity as sublime Christian heroism and a testament to the power of justice and truth. The abolition of slavery, achieved through years of struggle and sacrifice, marked a pivotal moment in U.S. history. While injustice persisted after the Civil War, this victory laid the foundation for the future achievements, including labor rights, women's suffrage, and other movements for peace and justice. The legacy of resistance, inspired by the words of Jeremiah and Jesus Christ, remains a defining part of the American soul. And I guess here's a picture of the tent revival preaching, the Second Great Awakening that laid the basis for the Second American Revolution. In our present time, with poverty and suffering rising among the American people and widespread hatred for the globalist imperialist system, those of us who want to take action must come to terms with what a successful revolution in this country will look like. The American people will not revolt like Chinese peasants in the 1930s or Russian factory workers in 1917. The coming American Revolution will likely resemble the English Civil War or the Second Great Awakening. It will be a mass movement of righteous indignation, a cry for justice against the rich and powerful, with a deeply spiritual and to some degree even conservative edge. It will be a demand for stability amid a wave of chaos fomented by the dark forces seeking to maintain their grip on power. It will celebrate human creativity and progress in opposition to degrowth and anti-human pessimistic sentiments. It will call for human solidarity and reconciliation in the face of those who stoke endless resentment, victimhood, fracturing, trauma, and isolation. It will cry out for truth and justice against the cynicism and postmodernism promoted from above. It will not consist of isolated acts of vengeance, nor will it aim to divide us based on regional loyalties or cultural views. It will be a mass movement to save the nation as a whole by restructuring the economy. While it will target the rich and powerful and the system of globalism, imperialism, it will also involve individuals rooting out the darkness within themselves, choosing a life of struggle, dedicating themselves to a higher purpose, and rejecting isolation and atomization by joining a collective effort for the common good. It will be led by forces that may not yet be widely known. The movement this country needs will not be broadcast on CNN, nor will it likely go viral online until it becomes too large to ignore. This movement, united by a deep commitment to the future of the country and humanity, and driven by truths that are like a burning fire within our bones, which we cannot hold in, will persist. It will endure, struggle, and continue building and preparing the way, even if it must function for a time as a voice crying out in the wilderness. And that is the end of my book, The Killing of Brian Thompson and the Danger of an American Years of Lead.